Last November, I turned off the highway into a 2-pump gas station in the middle of nowhere at around 1:30 in the morning. I guess I was kind of zonked from how tired I was because as I drove my car up to the pump, everything seemed as normal as could be. My eyes were locked on the pump display as I filled my car up, trying my best to not go a penny over $30, so it was only when I walked over to the kiosk to pay that I noticed something was off. The first thing that got my attention was how there was no one manning this kiosk. At first, I just waited, thinking the employee was just taking a quick bathroom break or something of that nature. But then as I started to look around, I realized the driver of the car at the pump in front of me was nowhere to be seen either. They weren't in their car, and they weren't inside the convenience store. So my first thought was how the driver and the gas station attendant must have been both in the back of the store, I guess. I got this momentary chill, thinking I might have interrupted a robbery or something, and I was suddenly very hesitant to knock on the glass or call for service. I remember turning to check out the car parked in front of me and thinking, if it's a Honda, then I'm getting out of here. But it looked to me like it was a 2011 3 Series. Now, if you don't know cars, Hondas are easy to steal. BMWs, on the other hand, not so much. And while that didn't completely preclude the possibility that there was a robbery in progress, it reassured me enough that I started knocking on the glass and asking if there was anyone there. I knocked once and then twice, and then after the third time, I knocked on the glass in as many minutes, and it hit me that something highly unusual was clearly going on. My first thought was to try the door to the convenience store. I'm pretty sure it was supposed to be locked, but when I pushed, the door swung right open for me. I walked up to the counter, calling out, "Hello?" the whole time. And then thinking there might have been some kind of medical emergency, I jumped the counter and took a look around the back of the store. There was a bathroom and a storage room and a small office, but all three were unlocked and empty. Then and only then did I realize that the entire gas station was completely deserted. I checked around the back just to be sure, but I figured that there'd be no one there. And then once I was 100% sure something seriously weird was going on, I pulled out my phone and got ready to dial 911. I wasn't still 100% sure what to do, so I called out hello again, but much louder. And when that got no response, I called the cops. I could tell that, at first anyway, that the dispatcher thought that I was just some jerk customer who was angry my gas station attendant wasn't there when I needed them. But once I properly explained that there was literally no one to be found anywhere on the premises or elsewhere, she started to take my call a little more seriously. She asked where I was, and when I told her, she asked if it looked like there had been a robbery. I remember asking, how the hell would I know? But she explained that if there had been a robbery recently, an employee might still be hiding somewhere. And I felt this sort of twinge of frustration because, like I said, I'd looked probably everywhere except the dumpster around the side of the gas station. And as I'm walking back from checking out the highway for signs of life, I just so happened to be passing it as the thought to open it popped into my head. I wanted to be able to say to the dispatcher, "There, I even checked the station's dumpster. There's definitely nobody here, ma'am." But when I opened the dumpster, there they were. I only caught a glimpse of what was inside before I dropped the lid of that dumpster and backed off like the thing was radioactive. But a glimpse was enough for me. There were 2 bodies in there, all bent out of shape with dark stains all over their clothes, and one of them was almost certainly wearing a gas station uniform. I remember saying something like, "Oh, Jesus, oh my God," pacing away from the dumpster in a state of total shock, with the dispatcher in my ear. Sir, tell me what's going on, sir." And I told her, "They're in the dumpster. Jesus fucking Christ, they're in the goddamn dumpster." The cops arrived in about 10 to 15 minutes, and by then I'd run off near to the highway to puke up all the contents of my stomach. And I'd remembered that thing about preserving the integrity of crime scenes, so in a wild panic, I'd actually puked as I was running, then had to hold puke in my mouth for a few seconds before I puked even more out near the highway. And after that, I just walked back and forth hitting my vape until I saw a cop car heading towards me down the highway, and then after talking to one of the officers for a few minutes, He told me I was free to leave. I looked the whole thing up online the first chance that I got later, but although I found a bunch of stories about a member of the public, yours truly, finding some bodies at a gas station, there was nothing that explained how or why those two people had been killed. And ever since, I've always been extra careful while driving at night, both in the sense that I keep a very close eye on my fuel gauge and try to avoid any nocturnal pit stops, but also, if a gas station looks a little too quiet, I'll avoid it altogether and just head to the next one. I used to work nights at a gas station called North Star Mart out near a place called Foster in rural Virginia. I used to drive up from Gloucester, get there at around 10 p.m., and then work all through the night until 6 a.m. when my boss, a dude named Judd, came over to relieve me. Judd lived right next door to the gas station in a big old house that he claimed that he built himself. There was no way that he built that whole thing on his own, but he was far too nice for me to call him out on it, so I just let it be. He was a great boss, too. I mean that from the bottom of my heart. Not many folks can say that they had a boss who had done almost anything to keep them safe, but I can, and it makes me feel a little guilty sometimes that I don't head up there to visit him more. But I don't like driving around Foster anymore. I don't like going anywhere near the place, and by the end of this story, I think you're going to understand why. I worked at the North Star for 9 months and 3 weeks, working anything from 2 to 5 nights a week, depending on how busy I was at school. Not a single customer in all the time I worked there ever gave me a single ounce of trouble. It was one of the best jobs I ever had in that respect. It was always a little busier on weekends, but during weeknights, I'd sometimes serve only 2 or 3 customers a night and spend the rest of my time watching movies on my iPod, back when that was like a revolutionary thing to do. Judd was really chill like that. He didn't give me a bunch of cleaning tasks, and he didn't give me any busy work at all, actually. And he only ever had one rule. If anyone ever showed up late at night, acting weird in any way, I was to call him right away. It didn't matter if the call woke him and his wife up from the sweetest dreams they'd ever had. If anyone was acting sketch, Judd wanted to know about it. I figured that was fair enough. The gas station was Judd's whole life. It was his retirement plan, so if it went up in flames, well, you see where I'm going with this. So even though it felt slightly emasculating, as in I felt like I could take care of the station myself, I agreed to give Judd a call every time there was any disturbances. When he first told me about his little golden rule, I'd be lying if I said that it didn't make me a little nervous, I guess. It suggested that there were a lot of weird people who came by the gas station at night, but that couldn't have been further from the truth. Like I said, 9 whole months and not a single instance of weird or disturbing behavior. And then one night, it happened. I was in the back office one night, splitting my attention between security monitors and a copy of The Dark Knight Rises, when I suddenly saw a lone figure approaching the gas station. We had 3 cameras, one facing the pumps, one facing the approach to the store, and a third which allowed me to watch the inside of the store from the back office. I can see the guy walking towards the store, past the pumps, and then into the view of the second camera, but then instead of walking into the store like literally everybody else, he stops dead outside the door. He's right in the view of the second camera, so I'm looking at this guy fairly close up, and he looked like a perfectly regular rural Virginian dad type. He looked like he had work boots on, some faded jeans, and a baseball cap with some kind of hunting or fishing logo on it. Literally the most unremarkable looking guy that could ever walk through our door. But his behavior most definitely got my attention. I guess it's not entirely true that nothing weird ever happened, because there was one previous occasion where I called Judd in the middle of the night. Some crazy lady was screaming like a demon out near the pumps. It was a Saturday, and it had to be maybe 4 to 4:30 in the morning, but just like Judd said, I gave him a call at his house. I told him about the lady and how her screaming was freaking me out. He asked for a description, I gave him one, and then he tells me, "Oh, that's just Rhonda liquored up on payday. She'll head home once she's tired herself out." And then you know what? She did. She eventually stopped screaming and then just kind of walked off, like she was done with that night's performance. Anyway, the guy in the sporting goods cap stopped dead and just stood there in front of the camera, not moving a muscle. Not nearly as freaky as screaming like a banshee, but still weird nonetheless. I figured he was, I don't know, taking a moment to think or something. But then, as I'm watching him, his head starts slowly moving, turning his neck until he's staring into the camera lens. I know it was just an illusion, but it felt like he was staring directly at me, and that was easily one of the most unnerving sensations I've ever experienced. Once the guy's behavior reached a concerning level of weird, I grabbed the phone and called Judd. I didn't even feel emasculated doing it either. Whatever that guy's problem was, it wasn't meth. It was something way scarier than that. Judd picked up the phone, then once again he asked me to describe the person acting weird. I started describing the guy, and then the next thing, Judd slams the phone down. I look back at the screen and the guy's disappeared from view, but he's not in the store either, so I'm thinking, where the hell's he gone? But at the same time, I'm also thinking, why did Judd just slam that phone down on me? He told me to call him if something weird started to happen, and the first time he sounded sleepy but pretty calm, so I was wondering what was so different about that time, when I suddenly see him on the monitors. Judd was running towards the gas station in nothing but his boxer shorts and a wife beater, and he was carrying a shotgun in his hands. He burst into the store and asked me where he is. Then when I say the guy just disappeared, and that I think he just walked off, Judd runs past me into the office to check the monitors. I'm freaking out too, because what the hell is he carrying that shotgun for? But no matter how many times I asked him what's going on, he kept silencing me and telling me that I needed to concentrate as he ran back to the security footage to get a look at the guy's face. I watched him, rewinding the footage until he finally found what he was looking for, and when he did, I watched Judd turn completely pale. Whoever it was, Judd was terrified of him. So terrified that he felt the need to come running over with a shotgun to protect me, and then that scared the hell out of me too. Judd sent me home that night after calling the cops, and the next day, he called to say that he'd understand if I didn't want to come back to work. I asked just one time if he could tell me who the man was, and Judd paused and then repeated the part about understanding if I didn't want to come back. I thanked him for the job, wished him luck, and then just hung up. Like I said earlier, I still feel guilty about not going up to see him more. He was a great guy and a great boss, but without knowing who that guy was, without knowing why Judd was so scared of him, I couldn't put myself in the position of working for him anymore. I didn't want to die for some stupid gas station job, no matter how cool my boss was. And if there was a guy out there who scared the hell out of one of the toughest sons of bitches I'd ever known, then what chance in hell did I have?
My mom used to work the night shift at a gas station in the early 90s. This is one of those mom and pop gas stations, so typically there was only about one person working the station at a time. During the night of the story, my mom's schedule had overlapped with one of her coworkers for 2 hours because there had apparently been an armed robbery in the same area the night before. So the owner was a bit concerned about being the next target of the robbers. After about 2 hours, my mom's coworker leaves. About a half hour later, there was a goth girl that comes into the station and buys a pack of cigarettes. The girl is fidgety but polite. My mom tells the girl to have a good night, then begins to clean the hot dog case. As my mom starts cleaning, she notices that the girl doesn't leave the station. The girl then starts walking around for about 5 minutes, just looking at random items on the shelves. My mom finally stops what she is doing, and she then asks the girl if she needs anything. The girl goes up to the counter and tells my mom that her car ran out of gas just up the street, so she needs to get some gas. The girl doesn't have a gas can, so my mom grabs one of the gas cans from behind the counter and then tells the girl the price of the can. The girl then says that she doesn't have enough money for the can. Mind you, she literally just bought a pack of cigarettes. My mom kind of wears her heart on her sleeve more than she wants to sometimes, so she tells the girl that she'll buy the gas can for her. The girl then smiles and thanks my mom. My mom lets the girl know that she doesn't have enough money to buy gas for herself, let alone for somebody else. The girl seems to accept this and then thanks my mom profusely. Goth girl says she has someone she can call who will stop by the station and give her some gas money. My mom then asks if she has enough change for the payphone, and the girl says yes. She thanked my mom yet again for the gas can, then leaves. My mom is really good at reading people, and while the goth girl seemed polite, there's something about the whole situation that was really giving my mom bad vibes. My mom looks at the surveillance footage that gives an outside view of the station. Instead of walking to the payphone, which is just left of the front door, the girl starts walking to a van that's parked really close to the station's exit. The girl then walks up to the passenger side of the van, and she starts talking to someone who's inside the van. She points a few times at the station while my mom is secretly praying she's not about to be robbed. The conversation between Goth Girl and whoever was in the van only lasts about a minute or two, and my mom just watches as the Goth Girl starts walking right back to the station. The Goth Girl comes back to the station and she tells my mom that she had got some gas money from her uncle, but that when she tried pumping gas, she had some trouble with the handle of the gas pump. Mind you, the gas pumps at the station are literally your basic no-thrills pumps. The girl then asks my mom if she could come outside and help her. My mom pretends to be calm, but she then starts to panic on the inside. She then tells the girl that she can't leave the station, so she asks the girl to try another pump. The girl says she tried them all, but she just can't figure out how they work. She asks again if my mom would come outside and just show her how one of the station's pumps work. My mom apologizes and she then explains that she's not able to leave the station unattended, or she'll be fired. She tells the girl that there's a gas station just a block up the street and that they always have multiple employees on staff, so she should be able to get someone to help her over there. The girl starts to whine and she starts to let out this really eerie sort of snarl. She then gives the fakest big smile she can muster and tells my mom that she'll only be gone for a minute and that she really needs my mom's help. Now, when she said that she really needed her help, her teeth were clenched and she started stomping up and down like a pouting toddler. Goth Girl then starts breathing excitedly like she's a rabid animal or something. At this point, my mom then drops all pretenses of being nice, gives the girl what she calls her cold bitch smile, and then says, "So, by the way, I saw you talking with your friends outside, and I already called the cops and gave them your friend's license plate number. They should be here in just a minute. They're so fast in this town." My mom was of course bluffing, and luckily for her, the girl seems to believe her. Goth Girl quickly leaves the store, gets inside the van, and right before she can fully shut the side door, the van is then peeling right out of the parking lot. My mom did wind up calling the police later on and then gave a general description of the van and girl. It didn't take too long for the police to find the van. It had apparently been abandoned on the side of the road near a wooded area. The girl and her friends had used hammers and box cutters to destroy the van's interior. The police didn't know what the girl and her friends had planned to do to my mom, but they said whatever it was, it probably wasn't even robbery. My mom wound up turning in her 2-week notice shortly after this happened. My mom's advice to anyone listening to this story is to always trust your gut instincts. They just might save your life one day.
So this was earlier this year. I moved to a different town and was finally settled into my new place. It was the night before Christmas and family was coming by early that morning, so I spent the evening cleaning and prepping for the next day. All was well, I was in high spirits and crawled into bed. It was the first time that I was hosting Christmas, so I was a bit too anxious and giddy to fall asleep. I knew that I should sleep soon, but I was just wide awake, so I played on my phone a bit and just passed the time. It was about maybe 10 p.m. or so. But then suddenly, I'm in the car with my husband on the highway and he's pointing at something in the sky frantically yelling, "What is that?" And the next thing I know is that I'm groggy and waking up, and there's lights around me and a dark shadow, and it feels like there's fingers pressing my temples and something is on my head. I vividly remember that feeling of dread and thinking, oh no, not again. I feel groggy but managed to mumble and lift my arm, which was heavy, and tried to say, I'm awake. I then just closed my eyes and wanted it to be over with, and I remember thinking, I hope this doesn't last long. Suddenly there's blackness and I snap awake. I'm drenched in sweat. There are 2 points on my forehead that are throbbing in pain. I'm in my bedroom again and everything as I left it. The TV is on, my phone is in my hand, and I'm thinking, man, that was a weird dream. Suddenly there's a loud noise and the power shuts off, leaving me in the dark. It scared me half to death as well, and I jumped up and tried to wake my husband, who was dead asleep. Finally, after a few seconds though, the power was back on and my husband thinks that I'm just silly. The thing is that I understand that it could very much have been just a dream. That's not impossible, I suppose, but I'm not much of a dreamer, and if I do, they aren't that vivid. This one just felt so real, but why? And why aliens of all things? I'm mostly into like ghostly stories, so I don't read or look up UFO stuff that much, and I remember the physical feeling of dread that it was happening again, and I could feel my stomach drop, and I felt sick when I thought, not this again. But the strange thing is that I don't recall any other dreams or experiences like this. It's just so random. It was Christmas too, so I definitely wasn't thinking about aliens or anything. Anyway, I don't know what to think of any of this. I guess I'm just sharing it to get it off my chest and reaching out, I suppose. So, if you have any idea about what any of this could be, then please do let me know.
A while ago, I got a job at a small hospital just out of town. I was excited as it was my first job I had been offered since my graduation. It was just casual work, but I was still ecstatic at the chance to work there, as the money was great, and it was the place I did my training at. Most of the time, I would do 12-hour shifts from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Sometimes I would work the late shift from 3 to 11. I never cared much for those. I was used to working late for my previous jobs, but I had to drive a lot further to get home. There was usually 4 nurses, 1 administrator, me, and the emergency doctor. That's it. Now, being in a small hospital like this one, you see some pretty strange things come in. Some people can't make it into the city, so we've had the emergency helicopter have to drop in every now and again. I've seen some pretty horrific things, like whole families dying from accidents on curved country roads. I've even had people bring in animals in desperation, as there was no veterinarian nearby that was open. This one particular night, around 10 p.m., I was sitting and talking with one of my nurses about a patient's chart, but I was mostly just wasting time until I got off at 11. The hospital was very quiet. I had only checked in 6 patients up to that point. I then heard a strange noise by the entrance. I then saw a man making his way toward us. He looked pretty normal, but he had on a long coat, which was strange as it was the middle of the summer, and even though it was dark, it was still very warm out. The nurse beside me let out a long sigh and got up to use the restroom, leaving me to deal with our new arrival. As he drew closer, the strange sound got louder, and something caught the light. He was dragging something behind him, but I couldn't make out what it was, although I assumed it was metal from the scraping sound it was making. It sent a shiver up my spine. He stopped at the desk, and I could see his eyes were wide, his pupils big. His face was pale, and it looked like he hadn't slept in a while. I had seen this look many times before, and immediately associated it with someone who was under the influence of something. He leaned on the desk and ran his fingers through his hair, pulling at it and grinding his teeth. When people like this come in, they are usually looking for drugs. Most of the time they will complain about migraines or fibromyalgia, anything we can't prove to the contrary. I processed him as usual and noticed he was becoming more and more irritable as time passed. Eventually, when I finished up, I pointed him toward the waiting area. He then asked how long it was going to be. Knowing that the on-call doctor had gone on a quick break, I estimated about half an hour. That's when his whole demeanor changed. The anger on his face was obvious as he stormed over to the waiting area, which is a room between the ER and the front desk. As he walked away, I caught a glimpse of what he was dragging behind him, and quickly came to the realization it was an axe. I panicked and almost called the code over the PA system, but I didn't want him to realize. I promptly called the police on my cell phone and ran down the hall to signal to the nurses we had an issue. The police would have to come from 2 towns over, which takes on average 20 minutes. Of course, as we were all pretty small girls, we didn't want to go near him. This man was tall and muscular. Even all of our forces combined, we wouldn't stand a chance. I calmly walked back to the front desk and paged the doctor, asking him to call me. I waited and waited, but I never got a response. I watched the man getting more agitated, and soon he began yelling and asking for help. I quickly hid from him. The other nurses and I devised a plan to lock him in the waiting area. The glass is reinforced and the doors are heavy, so it should have been able to hold him there until the police arrived. The plan went down without a hitch until the man realized what we had done. He started screaming and throwing chairs around the room. He then began using his axe on the door. We were all standing near the front desk and watching. I have never been so terrified in my life, and what made it even worse was the fact that he was making some headway on the door. It was around this time that the emergency doctor comes back from his break. He strolled through the front entrance, still sipping on a drink. When he saw all of us huddled by the front desk, he immediately took charge of the situation. After getting all the necessary information, he disappeared toward the back entrance, where the EMTs usually enter from. He then unlocked one of the waiting room doors, and then tackled the man when he wasn't looking. He bound the man's wrists together with cable ties and sat on his back until the police arrived. I was so grateful for having a young, physically fit doctor with us on that night. I bought him coffee every time our schedules crossed as a thank you, but I don't think that'll ever be enough. As this was the second incident I experienced while working the 3 to 11, I decided to never work late shifts again. I'm now on a Monday to Friday 9 to 5 schedule, and I feel much safer now. Last August, I was hospitalized in the voluntary psychiatric ward at the local hospital due to some major anxiety and depression issues I was having. It was unfortunately my second hospitalization, and this time I would have to have a roommate. No one knows why, but for some reason when the psychiatric unit was built, they decided to put in double rooms. Because of this, they would often have high-functioning patients share rooms. Since I was here about a month ago, when I showed up, the nurses all remembered me. Stays in the psychiatric unit average about 1 to 2 weeks. Because it's the voluntary unit, there's no actively psychotic or violent people here, usually. My roommate, Jane, seemed nice enough. She was an unassuming, petite woman. One thing she really enjoyed doing was sitting at her desk and work on crossword puzzles. In fact, that was the only thing she ever seemed to be doing. In the rooms, each patient gets a desk and a dresser, which are right next to each other. I was admitted to the hospital around 6 p.m. By 9:30, I had taken my medication and was doing some meditation before going to sleep. I was looking at this beautiful picture of a tree and fence that was mounted to the wall and focusing on it while slowing my breathing. That's when I saw that there was writing on it. I hadn't noticed it earlier. It was in pencil and was put into the picture with enough force to indent it. The writing said, "They are all liars. Liars." There were some other things I couldn't quite decipher. It creeped me out a bit, but I figure it had to have been the previous patient, so I went to the nurse's station to let them know. If you've ever been to a psychiatric ward, you'll know that most of the time, it's terribly boring. I spent most days walking around the unit. Some patients would actually count their laps. Apparently 30 laps equaled a mile. I also spent some time in the art room painting with a group. I began to notice that Jane never went to any of the groups. In fact, she never left the room. Then I realized that I had never seen her leaving the desk. Each time I came into our room, she would be sitting there, working on a crossword. I figured that's how she dealt with the boredom of this place. I tried to make small talk with her when I came in and out. I then realized something odd. The crossword puzzle she was working on never changed. It was the same exact one, with no progress being made. I would compare it to that scene from The Shining, where Mrs. Torrance discovers that all Jack had been writing for his screenplay was, "All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy." It's quite a chilling way to discover that someone has gone off the deep end. The second night I came back in around 10:30 to go to sleep. She was still sitting at the desk, working on that same crossword puzzle with the lights on. I shrugged at it, because by this point she was no longer responding to me saying hello or asking if she was going to join the group. It was possible that she could have been having a reaction to some medication or just didn't feel like talking. So I turned off all my lights and pulled my privacy curtain closed. The medication I was on at the time basically knocked me out, so I was able to fall asleep pretty quickly. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to one of the medical assistants asking my roommate if she thought it was time to go to bed or turn off her light so that her roommate, referring to me, could sleep. She didn't really respond to the person and didn't turn off the light. I ended up just rolling back over and going to sleep. At some point she had turned off the light and gone to bed, because I woke up sometime later in complete darkness. I was confused. The medications I was taking would usually make me sleep for 12 hours straight. I then realized I could hear someone talking. It was Jane. She kept repeating, "Jesse, help me. Jesse, help me." I responded with, "Jane, are you okay?" She didn't reply to me, but she kept saying it over and over again, so I thought she may have been talking in her sleep. Eventually I dozed off again, only to wake up again at some point later. She was saying the same thing, only louder this time. I knew that she wasn't talking in her sleep this time. I tried to get her to respond to me, but she never acknowledged that I was even there. She just kept raising her voice. "Jesse, help me. I need help, Jesse." I got up and went to go get the night nurse, whose name was Jessie. I told her that my roommate was calling for her. By the time we got back into the room, Jane was hysterical. She was crying out for Jessie and trying to get out of bed. Jessie did her best to calm her down, and I was rattled. But I was given another sedation, and I ended up going back to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, Jane wasn't in the room, and a table that had once been near her bed was now in front of the bathroom curtain. There were no doors because of self-harm risks. I went to use the bathroom, and there was an entire roll of toilet paper in the toilet bowl. Again, I went to go get a nurse because I didn't want to be the one responsible for flooding the bathroom. I had already flooded a private bathroom by accident during my first stay. When I went out onto the floor, I realized two things. First, there was a medical assistant standing by the door near the front desk. Second, Jane was also standing at the door. The door only opens when someone phones in, so I was confused as to why there had to be someone essentially guarding the door. I found out from another patient who had insomnia that my roommate had spent the night running around the ward and throwing furniture around. They had finally gotten security down to talk to her, and she calmed down, but then stood in front of the door and was still standing there like a statue. 4 hours. I went about my usual routine of eating breakfast and painting. I asked some of the assistants about my roommate, and they tell me that she's been standing there since their shift started, 6 a.m. It's now 10:30 a.m. That made me a bit uneasy, but I just kept painting. I notice something out of the corner of my eye. I look up and I see Jane outside of the room, staring in at me. She sees me look up and quickly looks away, but she doesn't move for a good 20 minutes. I get weirded out and decide to go back to my room for the first time that morning. She follows me into the room. I acted like I was just picking something up and leave again, and go to the assistant sitting at the front desk. I tell her politely that I might sound a bit paranoid, but that I think my roommate is following me around. So she lets me sit with her at the front desk. Because I'm sitting there with nothing to do, I decide to call my insurance company with a question. As I'm on the phone, Jane comes walking up with 2 plastic bins full of stuff. When they first let you into the unit, they give you a plastic bin full of various supplies. The bins were full of her stuff and my stuff. She also had the pillowcase off my bed that was full of my clothing. I lost it. Why does she have my stuff? That's my iPad. I kinda start freaking out. I do have anxiety issues myself. There were 3 nurses standing by, and they were flabbergasted. They had never seen anything like this. I'm now on the floor crying my eyes out, and someone kneels down and put their arm around me. It's going to be okay. You're going to be fine. I had my eyes closed and I assumed it was a nurse, but in a bizarre twist, it was actually Jane. I tell her to stop touching me, and then tell the nurses I want her away from me. The nurses ended up bringing me into a private meeting room to go through my stuff. They then tell me that Jane is going to be transferred to the involuntary ward at some point during the day. Unfortunately, due to Jane's behavior, I can't return to my room until the transfer is complete. While this was all going on, Jane has now moved to the back door, which opens up into a stairwell that goes down to the garden outside. There's no way for her to open it, obviously, and she just stands there for hours. After a while, I just start ignoring her, though she stares at me whenever I'm in her line of vision. It was around 6 or 7 p.m. My husband had come to visit me, and we were playing cards with another patient who had just moved into our unit. We were sitting in the cafeteria, which was right next to where Jane was waiting, separated by a wall of windows. I believe that she had stood there on purpose so that she could keep an eye on me. As we were playing rummy, we see the psychiatrist come up with 2 security guards. She starts explaining to Jane that she has to go upstairs now. Jane gets agitated and refuses to move. A security guard goes to take her arm, and then she goes berserk, turning to one of the windows and starts banging on it, looking straight at me and screaming for me to come and help. They literally drag her kicking and screaming upstairs. I was a bit shaken up, but at least she was gone now. I end up with another roommate, also named Jane, but this new Jane was super sweet, and she was in the unit because she was detoxing from a medication. My attending psychiatrist assured me that my reaction was completely normal, and so I started to feel a lot better. The next day after lunch, it was time to visit the garden. I actually really enjoyed going outside. It's refreshing after spending so many hours cooped up in the ward. At the time, we were only allowed 30 minutes. I became anxious when I saw that Jane, my former roommate, was one of the people in the garden from the upstairs unit. So I asked one of the supervisors if I can sit near them during garden time. They say that's fine, and everything goes okay. Jane doesn't approach me at all. Now you might think that I'm being a bit dramatic, but Jane is one of those people who only appears to not be paying attention. However, it only appears that way. When we came back inside, since I didn't need an escort back to my unit, I made sure to break off from the group and get away from Jane as soon as possible. But then, Jane makes a beeline, right for me, and she had to be restrained again. I didn't see her again after that. I think maybe the hospital staff realized that having her around me in any capacity was a bad idea. Something about me triggered her, and I don't like to think about what would have happened to me if she continued to be my roommate. This is a story that was told to me by my mother when I was old enough to understand what had almost happened to me. I was only a few weeks old at the time. In those days, when a mother had given birth and had taken their newborns home, midwives were sent from the hospital to check in on the baby and the mother once or twice a week. My dad was working, so he wasn't home, and my mother had put me to sleep and was going about her business in the house. 2 midwives had stopped by earlier that week, so she was confused when she heard a knock at the door. We lived in a very close-knit community where there was rarely any crime, but most people who lived there worked for most of the day, so it was basically deserted around this time. My mother was greeted by a male and a female who were both dressed in hospital uniforms with security badges. They politely asked if they could come in. They explained that they had been sent by the hospital. My mom let them in because they looked like professionals with the badges and uniforms. They even knew that she had a little girl and my mother's name. It was very convincing at the time, but that information was easy to access. The man said that he was going to take me upstairs to check on me, and the woman would look at my mom downstairs. However, my mother didn't feel okay about them wanting to separate us, and she explained that a pair of midwives had already been there that week and said that she was going to call the hospital as nobody had notified her that someone was coming just a day after. She also warned them that her husband, my father, was on his way home from work and wouldn't be happy about this unscheduled visit. At this point, the two got very defensive and said that they would leave after being really pushy with my mother to separate the two of us. After the back and forth, she finally got them to leave. They quickly changed their behavior to a more calm demeanor and said not to worry and that it must have been a mistake. What was even stranger, though, was that when my mom opened the door for them to leave, there was another person waiting in a car outside who still had the engine running. She called the hospital, and they told her they didn't have any midwives scheduled to visit her that day, and that they would always alert the mother if they were going to send one. They also mentioned that they would never ask to separate the mother and the baby. My mother gave them a description of the visitors, and they told her they didn't have any male midwives at that hospital, and that she should contact the police right away. Terrified, my mother called my dad, who came straight home from work, and they reported the incident to the police, but it never amounted to anything that we know of. Who knows what those two were planning to do? If they had gained access to all that information about my mother, they must have had someone watching the house and knew that my father wouldn't be home. And they had even gone through the effort of obtaining the uniforms and badges. Thank God my mom acted on her instincts and got them the hell out of the house. It's even more creepy to imagine what my life would be like now if they had gotten to carry out what they were planning to do that day. I don't believe this could have been a genuine mix-up. They had not followed the standard protocol, and no one told my mother they were visiting. And they were very rude and defensive when my mother challenged them, which is not acceptable behavior from a health professional. I believe we were very lucky they decided to leave. My mother couldn't have done anything if they decided to use force. I just hope they didn't do this to anyone else.
In autumn of 1995, when I was 5 years old, my parents moved us from suburban Dublin to a small town in a neighbouring county. Nowadays, that area would almost be considered suburban, but back then, it was the middle of nowhere, right before Ireland's economy started to really boom too. They bought a house that was about 2 kilometres from the village in a field surrounded on all sides by farmland, with a little cowshed directly touching the edge of our land. It had a long driveway up to the house, 3-bedroom 1900s dormer bungalow, and as a suburban kid, I hated the place as soon as we moved there. My parents were into their late 20s, early 30s at that time. They both had grown up in the city and wanted to experience country life, so it was an opportunity to do a renovation. And when we moved into the place, it was rancid. Nobody had lived in this house for decades, and I remember the water running yellow from the taps and the kitchen being non-existent when we moved in, and the heating wasn't installed yet. On our first Saturday there, I remember we watched what I think was Goldeneye. Could have been a trailer for it that I remember. I was only like 5, so it's a little bit fuzzy. We watched it though beside an electric heater with duvets around a tiny TV. What I'm trying to say is that it was bleak at first. As it moved into winter though, my parents were renovating room by room, and I experienced my first memorable snowstorm. Our electricity went out at one point, and I do remember my mum trying to keep me chill while she lit candles and stuff. And over time, things did eventually get better, and they renovated the upstairs room first. When you walked up the stairs, there was one big room that we all put our beds into that connected to an attic space, which I remember helping my dad put rat traps in and that sticky bug tape onto. Anyway, over time they renovated all the rooms in the house, and it turned out really nice in the end. It was very 90s, with loads of bright colours and a country kitchen and all that. But my mother was really depressed there, and this was a time before the internet took off, and in Ireland at that time, once you left the cities, you only had like 3 channels, and they were all Irish, which in 1995 was not a good thing. She just felt isolated, I guess, and I remember a few times she let me take the day off school and stay home even. I think that she did this because she was lonely though. Anyway, in August of 1996, they gave up and moved us back to the city. They bought a really nice brand new home right before house prices skyrocketed, and I even got to rejoin the class that I had spent a couple of months with in 1995. In 2011, when I was 21, my dad and I went for a drive together and decided to drive back to that town. And he started telling me stories about that house, and suddenly a bunch of experience that I'd had suddenly made a lot of sense. So, remember that big room upstairs? My whole life, I've had this sort of reoccurring dream where I'm lying in bed, my parents are downstairs with my family over, and as I close my eyes, I can see shadows moving in front of me between the hanging lights and the bed, as if someone is sort of walking back and forth in front of me. And I've had that dream maybe 20 times, I would guess. My dad told me that one of the major reasons they left was because they felt the place was actually haunted, apparently. This was obviously news to me, but my mum was already depressed being alone there while he commuted into the city every day. But that she also had experiences that made it very difficult for her to be alone by herself. But both of them had also experienced the shadows and the lights, apparently, and he told me that once she was brushing her teeth in the downstairs bathroom, it sort of felt a cold sensation, and then the back of her robe was pulled so hard that she dropped her toothbrush. But the bit that really freaked her out, apparently, was me talking to myself. My sister had been freaked out by this too. One night, and I remember this clear as day as well, my parents had friends over and I was playing in my bedroom, now downstairs, and I had an 80s arcade machine in my room that my dad had gotten somewhere. You didn't need to put change into it to make it work, but I remember very clearly that I was with a girl who wanted to know how it worked and stuff. And something happened, and she convinced me to get some change and try to force it in. I went to my mum and lied and told her that I needed £1 for the charity box school that they had given me. She gave it to me, and me and the girl tried to slot it in. My mum came in at one point, and she was really mad at me, because obviously I'd lied to her. I told her that the girl told me to, and my memory gets a bit foggy after that, but my dad in the car that night told me that there never was any girl apparently, and that wasn't the first time that I'd seen her. The other time, I was playing in the front garden at the gate, and my dad noticed me talking to myself. He came over and told him. He came over, and apparently I told him I'm just talking to the girl. And I do remember him being like, okay, that's nice, and not making a sort of big deal about it again, that there was no girl. One time when they weren't looking and I was with her, she actually touched me for the first time. And this is the only time that I remember that I really thought as a kid that something was strange. She sort of touched my hand and then just immediately disappeared. I mean, I was 5 and I didn't know what had happened, but one minute she was there and the next she was gone, and I had this incredible need to take off the t-shirt that I was wearing. It felt like that feeling when you know that there's a spider on you or something. I ran up to the house though and into my room and pulled my clothes off, stomping on them. My mum noticed this too, but I really don't remember anything after that. Anyway, the old house, the smells of rotten eggs and the birds constantly flying into the windows were creepy enough without all of that too, but it apparently really sunk in with my dad when he was at the mechanics in town one day, making small talk, and one of the lads said, "You're brave living in that place," because apparently it had been abandoned for years and had been known locally as a very creepy spot that people would stop and look into on the country walks and stuff, wondering about it. When we eventually got back to it on our drive, the place was once again abandoned and being used solely for storage by whoever bought it, I think. It still looks creepy to today, and the travellers or gypsies who bought it have put a big religious shrine in front of the house. But there were also big sort of beech trees surrounding it, and it had a proper gate and all that, but 25 years haven't been kind to it, that's for sure.
I like to start off by saying that Christmas is my all-time favorite holiday. However, every year, I remember what happened to my family on Christmas of 2019. I was 12 years old at the time. That year we went to my cousin's house to celebrate Christmas. It was a very fun night, and we enjoyed each other's company. We decided to stay at my cousin's house for the night and leave early the next day. We settled down in the guest bedroom and soon fell asleep. Suddenly I woke up at 4 a.m., hearing noises coming from downstairs. Against my better judgment, I decided to go check it out. As quietly as I could, I crept down the stairs and looked through the wooden railings into the living room. I saw a figure that appeared to be dressed as Santa, looking under the Christmas tree. I went back upstairs and woke up my dad. "Hey Dad, Santa came back. He's downstairs." After my dad became fully awake, he seemed alarmed by what I said. We went downstairs to find no one inside the house. My dad told me that I might have just had a bad dream, and we went back to bed. The next morning, when everyone woke up and was getting ready to eat breakfast, my uncle went down to the basement to grab some drinks, when he noticed that one of the basement windows was completely shattered. After the initial shock, my dad and uncle checked the whole house to see if anything was missing or damaged. After they were done searching, they rejoined us in the kitchen. But before they could say anything, a loud crash came from the one place that wasn't checked: the attic. My dad and uncle immediately ran upstairs to check it out. A shouting match followed. We all ran outside and the police were called. When the cops arrived, the officers quickly ran inside the house. A short time later, they brought a man dressed as Santa outside. We later found out that the man had a large knife on him. The officer stated that it wasn't just my cousin's house that was broken into. There were multiple reports of break-ins up and down the block. Before I end this story, there was something that I overheard the cops saying that might be entirely unrelated to this break-in. Apparently they had been dealing with attempted kidnappings of young children at the local mall, with perpetrators dressed as Santa. This story happened in 2016. At the time, I was living on my own in an apartment with my dog, finishing up college. That Christmas, my dad was only 350 miles or so away from me, 2 states away, as opposed to being over 2,000 miles away in my home state. So my mom flew in, and I drove in with my dog so we could spend Christmas together. The trip there in the first week was great. It was my first time living away from home, so it was nice to be with my parents again. However, the day before Christmas Eve, my mom found out that my dad was having an affair. And that kind of threw a wrench into things, needless to say. They fought all day into Christmas Eve. I got fed up quick, but I had driven there, so all I had to do was go in my car and drive back home. My parents were upset when they saw me repacking my car. It was now 7 a.m. on Christmas Eve, but I didn't really care. I'd rather spend my Christmas on the road than be in the middle of this drama. There was a lot of snow, but the weather had slowed down for the past few days, so I knew that the roads would be clear, and my car had 4-wheel drive. So I set off, and spent the first hour of my road trip just angrily venting everything to my dog. I filled up my car before I left, because I knew that the drive from my dad's apartment to my college town would be exactly 1 tank of gas. So whenever I needed to refill again, it would be in a familiar area. About 2 hours in, I wanted to give my dog a bathroom break to avoid any accidents in my car. That's when I pulled into a deserted rest stop to do just that. I hooked him up to his harness and made sure that I had my keys, phone, and my flashlight. I was cleaning up after him when I realized that he was doing these low, rumbling noises, the sound that dogs make when they see something, and he began kicking up snow with his hind legs. Now is probably a good time to inform you that I don't have a big scary dog. He's a barely 10-pound Yorkie. The Christmas sweater that my mom made for him didn't exactly help him look more intimidating. He may not be a guard dog, but he is a good motion sensor alarm. I looked up to see what he had been barking at, expecting it to be an animal, but it wasn't. There was a distinctly human figure in the distance. Had my dog not alerted me, I would have never noticed. There were not any other cars in this parking lot, and this place was fairly isolated. It was unnerving. I scooped up my dog and went back to my car. Normally when I picked him up, my dog would stop barking at whatever he sees, but that was not the case this time around. He kept squirming in my arms so he could look behind me, and was getting more and more worked up until he was almost clawing at me. When we got to my car, I finally looked back again, and this time, the figure was much closer, because he was full-on sprinting right at my car. I panicked and threw my dog into the passenger seat. I quickly got in and locked my doors. But of course, my car would not start. I had never had this problem before, but the engine was not wanting to turn over. My dog was now in the back seat scratching at the windows and was going insane, barking and growling. The man reached my car. He resembled any other homeless man I had ever seen, with layers of slightly torn jackets, some dirty jeans, with shaggy hair and a beard. He went from his sprint to a slow jog once he got into the parking lot. When he approached my car, he slammed his hands against the driver window.
"I need a ride."
He sounded out of breath, but very monotone. Sorry, no. I'm about to call a tow truck though. If you need a ride, you can get one from him." I knew that I looked and sounded scared, and the man started pounding on my window again with both fists. He said something about being cold and needing a ride into the city, and that it was Christmas Eve. But at this point I had stopped paying attention to him and was just focusing on trying to get my dog to calm down. He was still losing his mind in the back seat, still barking, growling, and scratching at the window. My dog has never before or since acted this way towards anybody. While he's not very fond of strangers or new people, he's always been the type to basically ignore strangers or any of their attempts to get his attention. So for him to be going crazy like this was a massive red flag for me. I held onto his harness to get him to relax, and I told the man that if he was cold, he could wait in the restroom for the tow truck to arrive. He motioned for me to roll down my window, and I shook my head no. I finally just put my hands over my dog's mouth, shushing him, and told the man that I couldn't help him. He looked angry, and then tried to open my door. Thankfully, it wouldn't budge, but it made my dog squirm out of my hands and went full-on ballistic again. I pulled out my phone to dial 911, and the second he realized what I was doing, he stepped back from my car and rushed into the bathrooms. Him leaving made my dog instantly lay down and relax. I explained to the dispatch what was going on. The lady was very nice, and she sent a police officer to the rest stop and agreed to stay on the phone with me until he arrived. The man came out of the restrooms and back towards my car. I began to panic again, but when he came close enough, I assumed that he could still hear me on the phone with the dispatch, and that made him run off in the direction he had originally come from. It took 15 minutes for the officer to find me. When we talked, we agreed that it was super expensive to get a tow truck out here on Christmas Eve, so I ended up deciding to call my parents to tell them that my car had broken down. My dad had a big pickup truck and was able to borrow a trailer from his coworker. The officer allowed my dog to sit in his cruiser to warm up while he looked around and followed the man's footprints for a while, but ultimately the man had vanished. My parents arrived around 2 hours later, and the officer helped my dad load the car up onto the trailer. I didn't plan on telling my parents anything more than my car had just broken down, but the officer filled them in about what happened anyway. Both of my parents then felt awful about everything, and they decided not to fight anymore, or at least in front of me. My dad was able to fix my car, but I think the entire situation really scared both him and my mom, because they ended up trading my car in for a new one the day after Christmas. They told me to consider it a late Christmas gift and an early graduation present, and my mom insisted on driving home with me when the holidays were over and flying out of my city instead. I never received any updates from the police if they ever saw or heard from that man again. Hopefully he's learned his lesson about harassing people at rest stops.
On Christmas Eve in 1989, I was traveling through Mexico City in my boyfriend's car. He was driving and I was navigating. There were Christmas decorations up along the streets and most of the traffic was moving at a snail's pace, taking care not to hit the dense pockets of people walking up and down the street. We were in a hurry though, so my boyfriend turned off one of the main roads and we cut down a side street to avoid the congestion. We made a few more turns and suddenly stopped when we realized we didn't have a clue where we were. I opened the map while my boyfriend put the car in park and lit up a cigarette. I was tracing our route on the map to backtrack us when something struck our car hard on the front side right next to me. I caught a glimpse of a figure slam into our windshield and bounce forward off the car. I cried out in shock while my boyfriend stuffed his cigarette in the ashtray and stepped out of the car. This is where the experience became strange. I've never shared this before with anyone other than my closest friends and family who I trust. While my boyfriend was climbing out of the car, I saw the figure who struck us stand up awkwardly, holding his head and limp across the street. My boyfriend completely ignored him and bent down to look at the front of the car. I rolled down my window and called out, "Hey!" to the man as he limped away. My boyfriend, thinking I was yelling at him, called back to me, "Don't get out." I called back, "What? Why?" And my boyfriend stood back up and I noticed blood on his pants from where he had knelt down. "He's dead," my boyfriend said, and he rubbed his face. "What? No he's not, I turned and started to point in the direction the man had limped away in, but he was gone. I got out of the car and stood up. I saw enough to understand what my boyfriend meant. The man we had struck had flipped off the windshield and caught his head in a storm drain. His neck was very clearly broken and he was bleeding heavily from 2 different compound fractures in his legs where he had struck our car with his bike. The bike itself was lying on its side by my feet, the front wheel bent sideways and the back wheel still spinning. I was in shock and kept jerking my head back and forth down the street the man had limped down on and the figure at my feet. It didn't make sense. They were wearing the exact same clothes. How many people did we hit? I asked my boyfriend. He looked at me like I had hit my head. Only one, he replied. Then he started waving his arms to flag down a police car. I sat down on the sidewalk and stared at the ground, feeling like I was going to be sick. I wasn't crazy. I hadn't seen a ghost because I had seen the shadow of the man cast on the stone wall behind him as he stood up and limped away. But there he was. The exact same man who had stood up right there on the ground in front of our car. The police blocked off the area, examined the bike and our cracked windshield, and determined the guy had been speeding down the hill on his bike and struck us without applying the brakes. They asked me what I saw, and the best that I could do was stammer that it happened so fast. I thought we had hit 2 people. We got a ride from a family member to my boyfriend's house, but I was still in such a state of shock that I couldn't even touch the dinner that had been prepared for us. People have since asked if the man who stood up was bloody or if I could see the whites of his eyes. Honestly, I don't recall seeing either. All I could say with certainty is that he stood up, held his right hand to his head and limped away. He didn't react to my boyfriend stepping out of the car. I don't know if I believe in ghosts or life after death, but if that's the case, this man was physically reacting to the impact that had killed him, seeming not to have noticed that he was dead. Occasionally I dream about that night and that impact, but in the dream I never see the man stand back up. I see a bright flash of light and then nothing. No details of the man himself after the hit. I never even found out the man's name. It was the worst Christmas of my life.
My goal in writing this out isn't to have it shrugged off as just another entertaining online horror story. I sincerely want to know if this experience or anything similar has happened to anyone else. That may help me sleep better at night, knowing that it's not all just in my head. I'll admit that I suffer from PTSD, but this is so much different from anything else that I've ever experienced during one of my episodes. Last Christmas, my friends and I had planned to meet at our hunting cabin and have a rustic holiday detached from the rest of the world. We were planning on just lighting a fire, having some drinks, listening to some music, and playing some cards. I arrived at the cabin first, just as the sun was starting to set. The cabin was set alone on the top of a rocky slope overlooking the highway, so I turned on all the lights so it could be seen from the road. I got the fire going and threw the beer into the icebox to chill. It had snowed the night before, so after I warmed up the cabin, I went outside and shoveled some openings by the driveway for the cars to park in. The entire time I was outside, I had that feeling that I wasn't alone. Not necessarily that I was being watched, but that someone else was on the property. I shook it off as paranoia. Unless they were here for the cabin, there was no reason to be this far up the hill. There was nothing else around except for trees and power lines. I went back inside and noticed a couple of missed calls on my cell phone. My friends had called me to tell me that they were on their way, and that they would be there within the hour. I got the food going in the oven, and brought in some more firewood. I had been sitting down for about half a minute, putting my feet up when I heard knocking at the window. It was a harsh rapping, clearly someone that was trying to get my attention. I paused and looked up. The noise hadn't come from the window around front. It came from the back window near the kitchen sink. It was the exact opposite direction that someone should be approaching from. That side of the cabin faced the woods. I stood up slowly and walked over to the window and peered out, half expecting to see one of my friends pranking me, but there was no one at the window. I peered out across the small area behind the cabin, and I couldn't see any movement. I walked over to the back door and opened it, shining a flashlight out into the misty gloom, and by the trees, I noticed an outline of a figure. I called out, "Hey!" and took 4 steps out into the snow when I stopped. The crunching of the snow beneath my feet was as loud as fireworks, and I glanced down at the tracks I made leading away from the front door. Then I slowly turned the flashlight beam over to the spot beneath the kitchen window. There was no tracks at all. For about 10 seconds I just stood there, looking back and forth between the trees and the window. I then turned around and marched back inside, slamming the door behind me. I set the flashlight down, furious with myself, convinced I was having another episode, sensing danger where there was none, being distracted by stray shadows and sounds. I sat back down in the chair by the fire as another rapping sound came from the front door. I heaved a sigh of relief, presuming that some of my friends had arrived. I stood up and opened the door. There was nothing. None of my friends were at the door. No cars parked in the yard. No footprints in the snow. I felt a cold sensation sink into the pit of my stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. Someone was out there, taunting me, distracting me maybe, keeping my attention away from the other side of the house. I was suddenly convinced that someone was trying to break in. I grabbed my sidearm from my bag and picked up the flashlight again, and I searched both bedrooms, the bathroom, and the small closet where the water heater was kept, clearing any place where anyone could be hiding, making sure all the windows were locked. As I moved back into the living room, I glanced out the side window and saw the shadow of an adult man, maybe 5'7", cast itself across the front lawn by the glow of the porch light. I had him now. I flung open the front door and pointed my weapon. But again, there was nothing. No figure, not a whisper of movement, and no footprints in the snow. I held my ground. I wasn't crazy. That hadn't been the shadow of a tree. It had been a person. Head, neck, shoulders, and torso. I knew it had been. I scanned the yard with my flashlight, going over every inch. No footprints except for my own. The back door then slammed behind me. It didn't shutter. It didn't swing shut. It slammed. I spun around and nearly fired off a shot. I then sprinted to the back door, flung it open, and aimed, only to be greeted by the single set of footprints I had made before. I shut both doors and locked them, shut off all the lights until the place was only illuminated by the fire. I put my gun in the filing cabinet, locked it, then dropped the key in a jar. I sat there by the firelight for another 25 minutes, listening to pounding noises from various windows from across the cabin, forcing myself to ignore them and remain calm. I didn't catch a glimpse of any other shadows from outside, but I wasn't really looking. I saw the headlights of my friend's car pull in. I stood up, turned all the lights back on, and greeted them at the door, as if nothing was wrong. For the rest of the night I drank with my friends, and kept a smile on my face, not giving any indication that anything was wrong. We decorated a mini tree and played cards and had fun. That night I slept on the couch and ignored the sound of footsteps walking across the roof. Now I would have dismissed all of this as just being in my head, and I wouldn't have taken the time to write it down and share it with you if it wasn't for what happened the next morning. I was making coffee, and my buddy came back inside after having a morning cigarette. His wife calls out to him from the bedroom and asked him if he saw anything. I asked what they were talking about, and he replied, "We heard the sounds of footsteps on the roof last night, but there were no footprints up there through the snow."
The best story my grandfather ever told me happened back when he was 18 years old on Christmas Eve in 1959. He was lying on his couch with a broken leg, which was perched on the arm of the couch, all wrapped up in a cast. He was listening to the radio and watching the snow fall outside as he used the poker to adjust the wood in the fire. It was about 8 p.m. and he was alone in the house. His family lived on a farm in the middle of nowhere in Kansas, and his father and brothers were across the property in the barn, roughly about a mile away. He doesn't recall where his mother was. He was reading something in the newspaper about President Eisenhower when there came a furious pounding at the door. An enraged voice screamed from the other side of the door that Owen, my great-grandfather, was going to die tonight. My grandfather didn't respond to this. Unable to move off the couch, he pulled the rug across the room until the shotgun which had been leaning against the fireplace was in reach, and he picked it up and cocked it, pointing it towards the front door. My grandfather says for the next 5 to 10 minutes, the man continued screaming, circling the house and pounding on windows, screaming for Owen to come out. He was clearly drunk and out of his mind and wasn't leaving the house until someone opened up. My grandfather winced as the man banged on the window right above the couch, but he still didn't move or acknowledge him. Finally, the man returned to the front door and pounded on it until he kicked it in. My grandfather said that he felt the blast of cold air and the stench of tobacco and whiskey as the man stomped through the dark hallway and walked right into the living room. He was a tall, lanky guy with brown teeth and an uneven gray beard, like he had only shaved part of his face. The guy's eyes were as big as hubcaps and he was barefoot, which was crazy as it was snowing outside. For about 10 seconds, the guy didn't even notice my grandfather, but was glancing around the room quickly, his eyes darting back and forth like a rat until his eyes fell upon the couch. He saw my grandfather, he saw the shotgun, and he froze like a deer in the headlights. My grandfather cocked the hammer back on one of the barrels. He had him dead to rights and the intruder knew it. My grandfather snapped. The man took a step back, looking more enraged than afraid. "Where's Owen?" he hissed. "Get out!" my grandfather yelled. The guy turned around, walked into the kitchen, and dug through the pantry until he found a pint of whiskey. He even turned around and looked back into the living room just to make sure the shotgun was still up. He threw back the whiskey, dropped the bottle in the sink, and walked out, calling back over his shoulder, "Tell Owen I said Merry Christmas." Once the guy was outside, my grandfather heard him knock over the pile of firewood by the steps. After another minute, he smelled smoke and realized the guy had set fire to the pile, likely intending to burn the house down. My grandfather hobbled over awkwardly, shotgun still up, barely able to hold it straight on his bad leg, and peered outside. The guy was gone, but there was so much snow around the fire and so much icy wind assaulting it that the fire was already nearly out. When Owen and the others got back and saw the charred marks on the front stairs, they asked what happened and my grandfather told them everything. Owen flew into a rage, took the shotgun, and followed the guy's tracks out across the fields with a lantern. He didn't come back until Christmas morning when the family was all gathered in the kitchen for breakfast. Owen tossed the gun down and hissed that the fucking thing hadn't even been loaded. When my grandfather asked if he got him, Owen nodded and responded, "Oh yes." And that was it. He never got my great-grandfather Owen to report exactly what happened or even know how he knew the man. My grandfather said that he never saw the stranger ever again. I asked him if he thought Owen had killed him and he responded, "I'm almost positive that he did." When I asked, "But how did he do it with no ammo in the gun?" my grandfather looked back at me and said, "There's dozens of ways to kill a man with your hands."
This didn't happen to me, but a close friend of mine. To avoid any confusion, I will write the story from his perspective. This happened several years ago when I was about 14. My family planned a weekend getaway to visit my uncle in Maine. We would stay in a cabin because my uncle's house was too small to accommodate everyone. We arrived at the cabin on a Thursday night and planned on staying until Sunday. It was Christmas Eve when we got there. I'll give you a brief layout of the cabin. It was a small, single-story ranch-style house with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a dining room, an outdoor balcony, and 1 bathroom. We unpacked our belongings and settled in for the night. The next morning, we headed to my uncle's house and spent the entire day there. We helped prepare a Christmas dinner and had a small fire going outside. After a long day of celebration, we drove back to the cabin, extremely exhausted. I got washed up and ready for bed. However, once I exited the bathroom, I felt a dreadful sensation come over me, an uneasiness in the pit of my stomach. It felt as though something was in the cabin with us. As a side note, I'll mention that I'm a firm believer in the paranormal. I cautiously made my way towards the dining room. When I entered, I looked towards the back of the room where the window was. The moonlight outside had bled into the room, casting a dim glow. When my eyes adjusted,
I then saw a dark figure standing in the corner. A pair of red eyes stared into my soul with malicious intent. My next actions are inexplicable. I still have trouble understanding what happened to me when I go back to that night. But I calmly walked towards the bedroom and ignored whatever was hiding in the dining room. I still can't explain it. I should have been mortified, but it was almost like my brain went into autopilot. I eventually woke up at exactly 2:17 a.m. to the sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway. I could have passed it off as one of my parents grabbing a drink, but the footsteps were slow and deliberate, getting louder and louder as they approached my bedroom. My worst fears came true when I heard my bedroom door slowly creak open. I ducked under the covers, hoping that the thing would just leave. But my prayers fell on deaf ears as I felt something sit at the end of my bed. There then came a low, menacing growl. I quickly shot up like a firecracker had just gone off inside my pants. I caught a brief glimpse of a black silhouette with piercing red eyes sitting at the edge of my bed. I then bolted out of the door, screaming for my parents. After calming me down, they asked what the commotion was all about. I told them about the thing that I saw in my bedroom, but of course, there was nothing there now. I was baffled because I knew exactly what I saw. I'm not crazy. I know the difference between nightmares and reality. It's hard to explain the kind of fear you experience when you see something with your own two eyes that you know should not be there. My parents did the obligatory lecturing about having a nightmare and brushing off any possibility of a paranormal event. We continued our stay until Sunday and left for home. To this day, I have no idea what I saw in the cabin that night, and I will not be returning to find out.
A couple years ago, my husband and I took a trip to Yosemite. We stayed outside the park in El Portal. One evening while we were driving back from the valley, I noticed that the headlights caught what appeared to be somebody laying down on the side of the road. Both feet pointed towards the street. I told my husband that there was a person laying in the pitch black on the side of the highway. He knows I love my true crime, and was absolutely certain that what I had seen was just trash bags. I was so certain, I just kept saying, "No, I saw a body. I know it was a person." We made our way back to the hotel, and as we were about to park, my husband looked over at me and said, "You're really sure about this, aren't you? You want to go back?" I was desperate. Yes. As we drove by again, I saw the feet. I had my husband turn the car back around and yelled at him to stop the car. He rolled down his window and said, "Hey, are you okay?" No answer. One more time, even louder. "Hey, are you okay?" Suddenly, the woman dressed in all black sat up. She was wearing a nice down jacket, black pants, and had her purse and 3 water bottles. Her makeup was done nicely and she seemed very sweet. I could tell my husband was absolutely shocked. I asked her where she was headed. She said that she was trying to get to the Chevron station up the road, and that her mom was going to meet her there to pick her up. This woman looked to be in her late 40s. I knew something weird was going on because where we found her, the Chevron station was still another 7 miles away or so. She said in her mind she thought it was only about a mile from her hotel, and she could walk it. We offered her a ride, and she climbed into the back seat. Not before I grabbed a thick scarf to wrap around my neck and pepper spray. As we drove, we tried to ask her questions. Just chit-chat. I asked why she was laying on the side of the road. She said she had gotten tired of walking and just decided to lay down, ready to give up. Whatever that means. It was winter and she had no hat or gloves on. I could tell she was very fragile. Once we arrived at the Chevron station, she thanked us, got out of the car, and sat on a bench in front of the closed Chevron station store. We offered to stay with her until her mom arrived, but she declined and said she would be fine. I reminded her that there was no cell reception in the area and triple-checked that she didn't want us to wait with her. We drove back to our hotel and noticed that there were now 2 police cars in the parking lot. They had not been there the first time we arrived back from the valley that evening. I told my husband I knew that they had to be there for that woman. I calmly walked over to one of the cars and asked if they were looking for a missing person, a woman. The officer told me that they were, and asked if I had seen her. I explained the situation and that I really felt like the woman had something very bad happen to her. He thanked us for picking her up and giving her a ride. He couldn't tell me what had happened, but thought her leaving and going somewhere else was a smart choice. I asked that he go check on her at the Chevron station, just to make sure she was okay, and that her mom did eventually arrive. I'm realizing that whatever happened was at the same hotel that we were at. That evening, I looked up the local police log and found that a domestic violence dispute had broken out at the hotel. The woman had been beaten very badly, and she was so terrified that she was willing to walk in the dark without a flashlight just to escape. It's my guess that after walking about a half-mile from the hotel, she was in so much pain that she just needed to lay down. I got the feeling like she thought she may actually die there. She couldn't go back to the hotel because she had already escaped and gone to the front desk to call her mom. Her husband knew she had been there and would have come after her. The front office called the police for her while she escaped. It's my understanding that the man who hurt her was her husband and was arrested. I always wondered about her and whether she went back to him. Did her mom ever pick her up? Is she safe? Now my husband listens when I say, "There's a body on the side of the road." At the time of this incident, I was 29 and my daughter was 3. I was in my bathroom bathing her and kept hearing a sound that seemed to be coming from the direction of my bedroom window. I wasn't concerned with this sound at first because I live in an apartment complex on the ground level, and people, especially kids, walk by the window in the mulch all the time. So I continued to bathe my daughter when the sound moved from my bedroom window to my daughter's. Now I noticed the sound shift, and so did my small dog. She's typically the quiet type as she's 12 years old. The sound was almost as if there was someone tapping a metal object against the glass. Alert at this point, my dog lets out this ear-piercing bark, one I have never heard from her before. Feeling on guard now, I removed my daughter from the tub and wrapped her in her towel and told her to stay in the bathroom as I proceeded to the kitchen and grabbed a knife. Fight or flight at this point is kicking in as my dog recedes from the direction of my daughter's room. I approach it. Entering the doorway, I begin hearing in a sing-song, low, guttury voice, "I'm here to play with a very pretty lady, a lady that I know, a lady that I see, a lady that I often see in my dream." Absolutely beside myself at this point, and my fight or flight sense is always in fight mode. I reached the window and drew open the curtains. As the voice kept singing the song and the tapping sound kept repeating on the window, I snatched the blind string and opened the blinds quickly just to come face to face with an old man, bearing a long and dirty beard, with eyes that sunk into his head and dark as the night was. He looked at me and grinned, a grin that I can only describe as the one the Grinch wore when he devised his plan. Stuck in a shocked panic for what seemed like an eternity, but was probably no more than a second or two, I began to spring into action. I turned, jetted into the bathroom, and grabbed my daughter and my cell phone. I ran to my front door, still holding the knife, just in case the man happened to run towards my door. I was dialing the police and on the phone with the dispatcher as I ran out of my door and to my neighbor's house. I proceeded to bang on her door with as much force as possible to get her attention. I wanted my child safe at least. She flung open her door, upset of course, until she saw the terror on my face. As I handed her my daughter and began to force myself into her apartment, the old man came running around the corner and into the breezeway, lunging straight for me with a knife of his own. I managed to get my neighbor, her 3 kids, and my daughter into the door as this maniac arrived within arm's length of me. Slamming the door, I told her to take the kids and get into the bathroom because that's the only room in the apartment that the door locks and that there's no window. The old man was now banging and kicking her door, as well as dragging the knife down it. I stayed at the door to ensure that he did not make his way inside, and as I'm sitting on the floor, my feet pushed up against the coat closet base, and my back firmly against the door, I heard a booming voice. "Drop your weapon and get on the ground, now!" I sat listening as the sounds of a tussle came from the breezeway. Then, boom, boom, boom. "You can open the door, ma'am. It's the police." Relieved, I eased open the door in time enough to see the one officer exiting the breezeway with the man, and another asking me if I was okay, and if I could answer a few questions. I spent about 15 minutes explaining the situation to him, as he jotted down the notes on his pad. The other officer then approached us with 2 window screens, as the old man had taken the one off my window and my daughter's in an attempt to get inside. The approaching officer asked me if I recognized the man, and I told him I have never seen him before in my life. This is when the officer looked at me and said that this man admitted having been following me for about a month. He first saw me at the grocery store, which is within walking distance from my apartment. Since then, he had watched and waited for the opportunity to try to get into my apartment, to play with me, according to him. This man followed me for a month. And to make it even odder, I would tell my then boyfriend that I felt at times as though I was being watched, and I was scared. The main thing I'm thankful for is that I'm the type of person who locks all the windows and doors, no matter how safe I feel. For a bit of context, after moving to a more rural area, I haven't been able to see my grandparents as much as I did when my family and I were living in the city. Because of that, once in a while they will take the long drive over here to stay for about a week or 2. Last Monday, that is exactly what happened. My grandmother, grandfather, and uncle came to stay for a week. Now, my family and I own a German Shepherd dog named Kane. He is about 2 years old, and boy is he hyper. Kane does not like anything coming onto our property or into our home, so he will bark for ages unless the thing leaves or we remove him from the situation. While my grandparents and uncle were here, he barked at each and every one of them through the glass storm door that's attached to our front door. And he would bark at my grandpa whenever he went to sit outside. One night, we had him inside in a dog crate because he comes inside to sleep sometimes. His crate was placed behind the couch, and sitting at the edge of the couch was my uncle. And once Kane got a good sniff and realized that he wasn't one of us, he started barking. So we had to put a blanket over his crate. Now that you know how crazy our good boy is, here's the story. As I'm telling this, my grandparents and uncle just left about an hour ago, and my uncle had quite a story to tell in the morning. Last night, Kane's crate was placed in my room because, well, I wanted him in my room. Always having outside dogs throughout my childhood, I never got to have one of them sleep in my room with me, so I was quite excited about our upcoming sleepover. After getting the crate in my room and placing a blanket down for Kane, we brought him in from outside and into my room. And in the hallway outside of my room, there are 2 bathrooms on the wall to the left. I closed my door so Kane wouldn't see one of my grandparents or my uncle trying to go into the bathroom and start barking at them in the middle of the night. After reading and talking to Kane a bit, I turned off the lights and we both went to sleep. In the early hours of the morning, around 1 to 3 a.m., my uncle got up from the couch to go use the bathroom on the other side of the house. We always have a small light on in the kitchen at night, so it isn't too dark. And I'm guessing that's how my uncle saw what he saw in the hallway. After walking from the living room and through the kitchen, he got to where the 2 bathrooms were. And sitting motionless in front of my bathroom door was what looked to be Kane. His mostly black fur almost blended in with the darkness, making it difficult to see his face. Ears straight up, not barking or growling, just staring, heavily unnerved. He turned around and walked back to the living room. A while later, my grandpa got up to use the bathroom, and lo and behold, nothing was there. My uncle was adamant that he did see Kane in that hallway. But Kane was in my room, inside of a locked cage and behind a closed door. And if he was merely seeing things due to being sleepy, the fear of the situation would have woken him up enough for his illusion of Kane sitting in the hallway to disappear. Sometimes I'll see a spider or multiple spiders on my wall while I'm half asleep, and once I blink or really look at it, they will disappear. But what my uncle saw didn't. So I believe that he did see something, but it wasn't Kane. It was something trying to take the form of Kane. For what reason? I don't know. But the intentions of that potential entity remaining unknown make it all the more disturbing. I live in the UK, and a few years ago I sold up, took early retirement, bought a boat, and dropped out to go on an adventure exploring the UK's inland waterways. I don't have a mooring through choice. The whole reason I bought a boat was to get out and explore, and doing this has taken me to some really interesting places I wouldn't have thought of visiting otherwise. I visited some urban and really lively areas like Liverpool, but also spent time out in the sticks away from everything in extremely rural and peaceful spots. It's pretty cool being able to choose your spot dependent on your mood, and if you don't like the area or don't like your neighbors, you can just throw your ropes and move. In the UK, the waterways license enables you to boat without having to take a formal marina berth, provided you genuinely keep moving, with most mooring spots being free up to 14 days before you have to move. This is called constant cruising, and if you have a decent craft, well set up for off-grid living, it's an amazing way of life. Many people choose this way if they're not tied by their jobs or on an adventure like me. But there are many living on pretty shady, unlicensed boats out on the network because they can't afford anything else, and some with some issues that you would be best to give a wide berth to. I am a lone female boater with just my dog snorkeling spaniel and 2 cats as crew, so I follow lots of boating forums to keep an ear out for problem areas or people and try to be sensible with my safety and my choice of stopping points. It's been very rare that I've ever had any sort of issues in the years I've been doing this, but occasionally I'll find I've got little choice about where I have to stop or how long for. In the wintertime, I can often come across navigations closed due to flooding or broken infrastructure, like a broken lock stopping me in my tracks. In summer, it's not unheard of for a canal to run out of water, and find myself unable to move until the level rises again. As I'm writing this, I'm stranded on a quarter-mile stretch of canal with river navigations at either end, closed due to flooding, and I've been stuck here for 2 months now. My cats like to go out, so I always try to moor away from roads and seek out spots where the cats would have an escape route from any pursuing dog, like a thick hedge or a fenced-off area of some kind. So I chose a spot right up at the end of this canal, alongside a derelict industrial area. There's a couple of gaps in the steel fencing a person can get through, and after checking it out to make sure it's reasonably safe, and finding mostly just piles of bricks and unusable but deteriorated roadway left, I've been in there regularly walking the dog, with the cats even trotting behind. Only once have I ever seen anyone else in there, and that was just another lady with her dog. My cats have discovered there's mice in there, and they're having way too much fun to come home as often as they usually do, so it's become a nightly ritual to have to go in with my head torch and dog and retrieve them before bed. They are both pretty great cats that think they're dogs, so if I go and shout for them, they'll come running and follow me all the way back. The first 7 weeks went without incident, but a few nights ago, I was in there shouting for one of my cats when I heard what sounded like bricks being bashed together in very deliberate, even-spaced multiples of 3. My first thought was someone was hurt and maybe can't call out, so they were trying to get my attention. So I stopped and listened. Another 3 bashes came, but this time, nearer. Okay, someone's moving and definitely not stuck. So I pick up the pace and think that this is just weird. It's 11 p.m. and below zero with ice everywhere. There's no shelter, just piles of bricks. So why would anyone be in here? My cat comes bounding up at this point, so I just scoop her up and practically run back towards the fence. Another 3 bashes. The first one really loud and heavily emphasized, and again, all very deliberate and evenly spaced. But this time, nearer again. I've moved quite a distance and turned a corner by this point, but the noise has followed and switched sides, like they had cut the corner and almost caught up with me. I get us all through the fence and back on the boat, locking it all down. At first, I don't hear anything, but my cats do, and they keep lifting their heads and alerting to something outside. But then I do hear it. The fence is only about 10 feet from my side of the boat, and I hear a growling coming from the other side. Loud growling. It was a god-awful sound, and I sat there scared witless, wondering what kind of freak would be doing that, and what they were going to do next. If you can imagine a human trying to mimic the sound of a slow revving motorbike, it kinda sounded like that, and this went on for nearly 10 minutes. I turned all my lights off in case they could see in, and sat awake for hours, too scared to sleep, and constantly watching my crew for any indication that they could hear anything, but there was nothing further, and I eventually fell asleep. 2 days later, I was walking down the towpath and walked past a small, rough-looking cruiser moored about 200 yards away from me. As I passed, I heard a man's voice mimicking me, calling my cat's name, like I had been that night before. I looked over and saw a really scruffy and dirty-looking man, I would say in his 30s, with dark hooded eyes and god-awful teeth, grinning at me. I have no doubt this was his way of telling me that it had been him that night, and he looked like he was now trying to freak me out even more. So I stopped for a second and gave him my best defiant, "I'm not scared of you, and you would think again, because I am a secret badass" stare. I even managed a sly psycho-esque grin of my own right back at him before walking off. I don't know why I reacted like that. Generally, challenging someone who might be unbalanced is a dangerous thing to do, and wouldn't be my usual approach. Apart from the fact he looked mentally ill at best, possessed at worst. Anyone who roams around at night growling has some real scary issues. But just there in the moment, I just instinctively felt the need to stare him down and not show fear. And boy, do I hope my instincts were right, because I am still stuck here, and despite my bravado, I am in no way a badass. Thankfully, haven't seen him since. In fact, in the 2 months I've been here, that was the only time I have clapped my eyes on him at all, despite walking past the boat every other day. I really hope to keep it that way. And as soon as those navigation lights change to signify the river is open again, me and my furry crew are out of here. And to the possessed-looking growling guy, I hope your boat is as clapped out as it looks, so that you can't follow.
In early 2007, I was on a traveling singing group. There were 8 of us on a team, and the team members were switched every single year. We were invited to stay at the evening at the house of a previous member named Drew. Drew wasn't home, so it was his mom, his sister, and his brother who hosted us. Now, we'd all known Drew's dad died about 4 years earlier, but he died of a heart attack and not in the house. I generally try not to be superstitious, but I went into the house and immediately felt just a little uncomfortable. I think I blamed it on the fact that Drew and I never really seen eye to eye, or that I felt bad for his mom, who'd been widowed so young and left with 3 children. A sleeping space was very limited, got put down on a cot in the basement, along with the other girl in my team. The basement wasn't a creepy basement by any means. It had been refinished and was pretty comfortable. My cot was only about a foot from the wall, and there was a small old digital clock between the wall and the cot. I fell asleep in my usual manner, facing the wall, back to the room. At 2:48, and I'll never forget the clock since it was the only thing that I could focus on, I woke up very suddenly. I was immediately frozen in bed. My heart was racing. My throat went tight, and I couldn't swallow. This was primal fear at its best. I couldn't roll over to check, but I swear, even now, that something was standing over me. Everything in my instinct told me not to turn around. It felt like my life was depending on me staying right where I was. During this time of intense fear, I kept seeing images in my mind, flashes of gore and horrible things. I could also hear a laughing in my ears, but not the voice of just one person laughing. It sounded like I was in a room with thousands of voices laughing. I remember for the first time having suicide run across my mind during this overwhelming, fear-driven time. I should note here that I'm not, and I've never been suicidal. When that feeling went away, the last thing I remember hearing in my mind was, "Not this one." I looked at the clock again, and only 9 minutes had passed. The longest 9 minutes of my life. A few hours later, when I got up, I decided I was going to get the hell out of there as quickly as I possibly could. I skipped the shower and breakfast and sat in the van waiting for the rest of my team. As I was waiting, Drew's brother came out and spoke with me. And in one sentence, he said, "I'm sorry I couldn't help you this morning." As he said it, he had tears in his eyes. He honestly looked like he was going to be sick to me. The look of hopelessness in his eyes still haunts me to this day. 2 weeks later, we got word that Drew's brother had killed himself just before 3 a.m. Ever since the incident, I still occasionally will have dreams about that laughing. Part of me wonders if I would have just tried talking to his brother, maybe things would have been different. I never spoke about this to anyone but my husband. It brings back a chill to my spine just writing this down, and an overwhelming sense of guilt. I don't know what to make of it, or what the hell really happened inside that house, and part of me never wants to know either. This story is from a childhood friend who told me this, and it still unnerves me to this day. She was genuinely freaked out, and her family even backed up her claims, so here it goes. My friend and her family moved into this rental property, and my friend claimed that it was haunted. Everyone agreed that there was an off feeling, and those who visited or stayed over there would mention it as well. I myself experienced this odd feeling of foreboding whenever I went over there, and believed the consensus that the house was indeed haunted. It honestly felt oppressive inside there, and you would feel this pitiful dread that is hard to compute into words. It was extremely uncomfortable to experience, just to say the least. Anyway, this particular event, and that is the basis of this post, was enough for my friend's family to pack up and stay with relatives until they moved out permanently. On this fateful afternoon, my friend had arrived back home from the park and heard an argument taking place in the kitchen between her mom and dad. My friend thought this was odd, as both of her parents should be at work, so she called out, "Mom," before unlocking the front door and going inside. My friend said the house felt instantly silent. An uncanny silence, like all the air had been sucked out of the place. It felt stifling. It felt wrong. Then her mom said, "Hey, we're just in here." My friend was just outside, closed the kitchen door at this point, and froze beyond opening. It was her mother's voice, but there was something off. Like the cadence was missing that made it actually her mother's. It sounded flat and unnatural. My friend decided to bolt back out the front door and wait until her brother came home. But she said as she turned back, she saw her mother peering at her from the lounge room window. But it wasn't her mother. The face was the same. Everything was the same. But her face was devoid of anything that actually made it her mother. There was no recognition on her mother's face. There was no indication that she was looking directly at her daughter. There's no emotion in the expression. Nothing. The eyes looked unstaring and utterly blank. My friend screamed and ran down the street to her mother's work and confirmed that she was there this entire time and had never been at home. Initially, my friend's mother reasoned that someone must have broke in, but at a later investigation, it proved nothing had been stolen. The back door was locked, as was the front door when my friend came home. No one could rationalize who my friend saw in the window and why it looked so much like her mother. So that was the deciding factor to nope the f*** out of there and find somewhere else to live. The landlord of the house denied anything like this had happened while they lived there, but did admit that tenants didn't stay long, saying there was something wrong in the house. My friend also told me that she was the only one who actually saw anything definitively sinister inside that house. But her family said they definitely felt an evil presence there, which ultimately manifested into the doppelganger experience that my friend had had. Utterly terrifying.
When I was just a kid, my father was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and it quickly became very severe. He started thinking the FBI was after him, becoming incredibly paranoid, and he even got into legal trouble for abusing 911. From what my mom told me, he started becoming friends with a variety of very sketchy people that included other mentally ill people, drunks, drug addicts, prostitutes, and homeless people. One day, he didn't come home from work. This was before cell phones were popular. When my mom called his job, they said that he had left on time, and everything seemed normal. She called our family members and some of his real friends from before he had gotten sick. Nobody knew anything or had seen him. When he didn't show up at the house by bedtime, my mother called the police and explained to them that my dad left without any of his belongings except for his wallet and his car, and nobody knew where he was. They eventually agreed to file a missing persons report. His car was eventually found abandoned outside of a shopping center 2 weeks later in New Jersey, 200 miles away from our home in Maryland. Since then, there has been no activity on his credit cards. No family or friends have heard from him, and the detective involved with his case suspected foul play. There were no developments in the case until 15 years later. I was attending college 6 hours away from my hometown, living in a rented house off campus with a few of my friends. While I was at class one day, 2 disheveled-looking middle-aged men knocked on my door, and in a very polite tone, asked for me by my full name, saying that they had to talk to me and that they were friends with my dad. My roommate said they seemed friendly enough at first, and he started asking them normal questions, like who they were, if they wanted to leave a message for me, and how could I get in touch with them when I got back. They gave very dodgy responses, almost as if they were trying to avoid giving away who they really were, and would follow up with more questions about me, like where I currently was, could they get my cell phone number, and was the car in the driveway with the Maryland plates mine. My roommate told me he started to get bad vibes from them, and said that he was calling the police and slammed the door on them. They immediately fled. My roommate worked with a sketch artist affiliated with the detective on my dad's case. Nobody recognizes who they are. and we never saw or heard from them again. That happened 8 years ago. It has been 23 years total since my father disappeared, and we still have no answers. This is a story from my past. It happened about 32 years ago, in East Texas. My mom and dad divorced when I was 16 years old. My brothers and I lived with my mom. My dad would visit us every once in a while, but not really on a consistent basis. He was a gambler, one of the reasons my parents split up, and tended to not come around when he was broke. But on the rare occasion that he had won big, he would visit and spend money on us, and then disappear again. My dad said he worked as a shuttle driver for a local hotel. He told my brothers and I that the job was just a front, and that he actually worked for organized crime, which he claimed owned the hotel. He said his real job was to drive out to various places in the area to pick up fugitives running from law enforcement and bring them back to the hotel to hide. My dad said that they would eventually move on, but that he didn't know the particulars about that. My dad was always a blowhard, always exaggerating or outright lying. So my brothers and I thought he was completely full of shit and didn't think much about his claims. Until something strange happened, and my dad disappeared. It was 1988. I was 22 years old and a college student still living at home. I worked as a full-time disc jockey at a local radio station from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. My middle brother, who was 19 years old, rented out an apartment with his friend and worked at Dairy Queen. My youngest brother was only 9 and obviously still lived at home with my mom. One day my 19-year-old brother called my mom and I and asked us if we knew where my dad was. He said that some men came to the Dairy Queen where he worked and asked him if he had seen his dad recently. He truthfully told them that he hadn't seen or heard from my dad in months, and that this was a regular thing, which was 100% accurate. My brother said these men didn't say who they were, but seemed satisfied, and left. He was wondering if these men or anyone else had called to talk to us and ask us about where Dad was. But the same thing was true for us. We also hadn't heard from him in months. The following day, my brother says the men returned to his work, and this time they had badges, claiming to be FBI agents. He says they were very aggressive and demanded that he tell him where my dad was. My brother kept insisting, truthfully, that he didn't know, and said the last he heard, he was working at a hotel as a shuttle driver. This experience upset him, and he called my mom and I again. My mother became very upset and called the hotel where my dad worked. The man she spoke to said my dad had disappeared weeks ago and had no idea where he was. The following day, my brother was at work when his roommate called and said that somebody had apparently been in their apartment. When his roommate got home, he found that the sliding glass door was open and the place had been ransacked, but that nothing appeared to be missing. Of course, when my brother received the news, he was very upset. He went to the apartment and found, in fact, that a few of his belongings were missing. But before we get into that, I should mention that my brother was a young father at this point in his life. The missing items were an address book, a teddy bear that he had bought for his son, and a photo of his son that he kept in his room. They were sending a message. Now we were all beside ourselves with anger, fear, and paranoia. We went to the local FBI office to complain and tell them once and for all, my brother did not know where my dad was. Well, as you might have guessed, the FBI claimed no knowledge of the event and told us that they were not looking into my father at all, and that none of their agents had contacted my brother. Furthermore, when my mother told them that my dad claimed to be working for organized crime, the FBI can neither confirm nor deny that the hotel had ties to the mafia, or if there was an ongoing investigation. My mom called the hotel again and told the manager that someone was looking for my dad and that they were terrorizing my brother, and flat out asked the guy if there was any truth to my dad's claim to be working for organized crime. The man laughed at her and said, "There's no such thing as the mafia." While we were trying to make sense of all these weird details, we kept wondering why my brother was the only one being harassed, and not my mother or me. That's when I was reminded of a strange event that happened to me about 2 or 3 weeks prior. Because I work overnight, I was often wide awake in the middle of the night on my days off, with nothing to do. One night, I went to the local cable TV company where my friend worked as a computer systems operator, just to hang out with him for a few hours and make small talk. It was around 3:30 a.m. He had a big computer repair project that he had to do that night, so it was time for me to head back. As soon as I pulled out from his company's parking lot, a car was immediately behind me, tailgating me. I mean, they were on me so quickly, it scared the crap out of me. The car seemed to just appear out of nowhere. He also had his high beams on, making it hard for me to see. I couldn't make out anything about the vehicle. I couldn't see inside to tell how many people were in the car, what they looked like. Nothing. I changed lanes to let the tailgater pass, but the car stays behind me. I move again, and they move again. They were still tailgating me. I stopped at the intersection and got in the left turning lane with my signal on, and again the car follows behind me. Since there was no other traffic around, the light changed. I zoomed across the intersection into the far right lane, trying to lose them, but they stayed on me. I cut into a nearby neighborhood trying to lose them, but they followed me the whole way. I finally managed to get back out to the intersection. I crossed over and went to the 7-Eleven at the corner. I jumped out and ran inside, yelling at the clerk that there was someone following me and that my life was in danger. As I did, I saw the car that was pursuing me cutting through the parking lot of the gas station, and for the first time I could see the car. I couldn't tell the make or model, but it was a tan-colored 4-door car, and there were 2 men inside. After passing by the storefront, they drove off. The clerk just blew me off and said that I was exaggerating, that it was probably just kids messing around. I eventually left, but I was still freaked out, and I didn't want to go straight home, afraid that they may follow me. And after what just happened, I didn't want them knowing where I lived, so I instead drove to my workplace. I knew that the disc jockey on air that night would be my friend Paula, so I decided to go visit her while she was on air. Perhaps we could make a segment out of it. I told her what happened, and I hung out for about 2 hours. She also felt that it was probably just a prank, and that helped calm me down. It had been over 2 hours since the first incident, and I was now heading back home. As I was coming down the street toward my apartment building, I see that same damn car pulling out of my parking lot. As it passed me, they flashed their high beams on. It had to be them. I panicked and rushed inside and called Paula at the radio station and relayed to her what had just happened. "Oh my God, they were waiting for you at your apartment? You have to call the police right away." My mind was racing as to how they could possibly know where I lived, why they would wait there for 2 hours, and then when they finally saw me, they just flashed their lights, and that's it? None of this made any sense to me. Remembering that event, and putting it together with my brother's FBI visit, and the apartment break-in, it seemed obvious it was all tied together. I hadn't thought about it before, but now I remembered. The car that I was driving used to belong to my father. He had given it to me about 2 months before this happened, when he had gotten a new one. So if someone had been looking for my dad, they could have thought that I was him, and when they saw me coming home, they realized that I wasn't him and just left. But who was messing with us? And why? Where the hell was my dad? My mom, my brother, and I went to the police station to file a missing persons report, and we spoke to a very nice detective. About 5 days later, we get a phone call from him. It turns out that my dad disappeared because he owed over $50,000 in gambling debts. The detective did confirm that he did work for some unsavory characters, but they weren't exactly organized crime per se. He had no idea if my dad was shuttling fugitives or not. The detective said that he was likely hiding out somewhere in Nevada, and that he had spoken to him over the phone. He was alive and well, but in hiding. We then asked who the hell were these men bothering my brother and I. The detective explained it wasn't uncommon for bounty hunters or debt collectors to impersonate law enforcement and call and harass people. My brother then asked how they managed to get into his apartment. The detective said a sliding glass door was pretty easy to open, and that they probably stole the address book hoping to find my dad. They also took the teddy bear and pictures to scare my brother, which worked. I then asked the detective why the men only harassed my brother, and not my mom and I, except the one time. It was then revealed that my dad had used my brother as a reference on his job application at the hotel and put down my brother's address and phone number as his own. The fake FBI agents probably figured he was close to my dad and maintained contact with him. So my dad eventually turned back up in town and acted like nothing ever happened. He never spoke of this incident, and we never brought it back up. I guess he ended up paying off the money he owed. I don't know the details surrounding that. But yeah, that's my story. This happened a long time ago, before cell phones were prevalent. I was a mother in my early 30s who had just driven my kids to the pediatrician. The doctor's office was in Macon, Georgia, and was about an hour away, and I was taking the two youngest of my 3 to our scheduled appointment. At the time, they were ages 1 and 3. Because we lived so far away, their office gave us the last 2 appointments of the day, and I was grateful for that. The doctor had just built a new facility off the highway, so the location was quite isolated in every direction. But it was a very nice building compared to his old spot by the hospital. His new building was also pretty far back on the new lot. My black Jeep Cherokee was only one of 4 or 5 cars in the lot when we arrived. I parked near the front door, removed the kids from their car seats, and for the next hour or so we waited, then saw the doctor, paid, and we were finally heading back outside. By this point, my Jeep was the only one left in the parking lot. I loaded up the children into the car seats for the long trip home, but as the receptionist locked the front glass doors, my car, for some reason, would not start. Whenever I turned the key, there was just this odd clicking noise. Gathering the children once again, I knocked on the front door until someone allowed us back inside, and I asked to use their phone so I could call a nearby garage for service. I found one in the phone book. Remember those? The attendant I spoke to on the phone said that he would be there, but that it might take a while. I told him my location and left to get back into the Jeep, rolled down the windows, and loaded the kids back into their car seats once more, and we waited. We watched as all the lights were turned out in the building, and everyone left, their cars departing one by one from the employee parking lot behind the building, leaving us completely alone. I spent a lot of the time trying to tend to the children, digging through our car for snacks and a bottle, and making sure they weren't getting too hot. Although the service station attendant said that he was probably going to be a while, I was surprised when I saw a truck pull into the empty lot, and pretty soon, a man stepped out. He smiled and nodded, and said that he was going to raise the hood. He was a middle-aged man, a bit scruffy looking. But honestly, most of the folks I know who work on cars often look like that, especially at the end of the day. I was just grateful that he was here working on the car. I sat down again in the driver's seat with the door open waiting for him to tell me to try the engine. But he seemed to be taking a long time checking all the connections. I wanted him to just grab his jumper cables or something, but he never did. Without getting out of the car, I asked him what was wrong. He responded, "Oh, it's just a loose wire. It's not the battery," and continued with whatever he was doing. I couldn't see his face at all from where I was sitting, but his hands were slightly visible through that long horizontal slit between the windshield and the raised hood. More than once, he said that it was just a loose wire. "Can you just come up here real quick and I'll show you which one, so that this never happens again?" I remember kind of smiling and shaking my head, saying that there was no reason to show me anything, as I know nothing about cars. I politely thanked him and stayed in the driver's seat. Again, just waiting for the inevitable signal to try to start the ignition. Surely that was coming any moment. At one point, I remember thinking that he was definitely flirting with me as he spoke. I was trying above all to be polite and kind, as I thought he was trying to help us, but we were hot and tired and miserable. And truthfully, I was distracted with the kids. He was beginning to sound a bit frustrated with me because I wouldn't get out and look at the engine. I remember thinking that I certainly didn't want to make him mad to where he left us all alone with the sun sinking so quickly. And then the strangest thing happened. Another truck suddenly pulled into the parking lot, and as it did, the man suddenly slammed the hood shut, ran to his truck, and quickly drove away without even saying goodbye. I was both confused and a bit anxious when he did this, because I didn't know who was arriving. I remember feeling a bit apprehensive that he had left me there all alone with my two little ones, completely defenseless. Why wouldn't he at least stay or speak to whoever just pulled up? That certainly seemed like the gentlemanly thing to do. I looked around and was very aware. Once again, there were no visible cars on the road, no homes or businesses nearby, and the sun was continuing to set. It was near dark. As this new, unmarked pickup truck pulled up next to me, I got out of the car once again. This time I was a bit more apprehensive. Upon exiting, the man immediately introduced himself. His name and voice seemed to match who I had spoken to on the phone earlier. He actually called me by name and apologized for being so late. He then asked me who that man was who had just left. Relieved and unfazed, I just smiled back in surprise and told him, "Well, I don't know. I thought all this time he was you." We both laughed, and he grabbed his jumper cables, walked in front of my car, raised the hood, and began to work. I immediately sat back in the driver's seat once more, suddenly grateful that, with a bit of luck, the air conditioner will be blowing at full blast here shortly. While listening for the man to tell me to try the engine, I had my back completely turned as I was checking on the children. The man surprised me by suddenly coming near the driver's side door. He then said in a very concerned voice, Ma'am? Is this yours?" When I looked in his hands, he was holding a very long, dagger-like object that was about 1.5 feet in length. It appeared to be very old and covered in rust. On one end, it had these tiny circular finger holes, as if it was a mix between a sword and a pair of scissors. I remember being amazed, but not frightened. I asked where he had found it. "It was under your hood." I just said, matter-of-factly, that I had never seen it before. He continued to stand there and stare at it. He looked oddly pale, as if he couldn't find the words to say, and just continued staring at the unusual object. Honestly, all I cared about was getting the Jeep started. Nothing else mattered. He didn't say anything else. He just set it on the curb, started his truck, and then signaled for me to start the Jeep. When the engine eventually started back up, my 3-year-old cheered. I quickly turned the AC on at full blast, rolled up all the windows, and aimed the air vents toward the back seat, and reached for my purse to pay. I got out of the car, took a few steps toward him so that he could tell me what I owed. He came back around to my driver's side, but instead of handing me the bill, he walked right past me and picked up that strange object again. "Ma'am, I want you to look at these one more time." He held it out for a closer inspection. This time I moved a bit closer and really looked at it. In his hands, the item still appeared incredibly large, possessing an almost bayonet quality, except for the small loopholes at the end. I had never seen anything like it, and I told him so. As he held it, he spoke quietly, as if desperately trying to make me understand something that was somehow still going over my head. "These were not hidden in your engine, ma'am. They were sitting right on top, meaning that they had just been placed there." I shook my head and smiled. "They're obviously very old and rusty." To which he pointed more closely and replied, "Yeah, but do you see how sharp it is? This blade looks like it has just been sharpened." When I looked down, I could see that he was right. The long dagger-like shape was unusual, but by far the oddest quality was just how sharp it appeared to be. The edges at the tip where the rust had been removed was shining. As I paid him, his final words to me were, "I don't know what was about to happen here, but I'm really glad I pulled up when I did." He quietly thanked me when taking the payment, and told me that I probably needed to contact the police when I got home, and then asked me where I wanted him to place the dagger. I didn't even want to take it with me, but I opened the back window so he could place it in the trunk. We left the lot together, him turning one way and me towards the other, heading down the small winding highway that led home, which was still an hour away. The moment that we arrived home and the children were safely inside, I did in fact contact the police. Although the officer on the phone listened politely, he declined when I offered to bring in the scissor-like sword. I was told that they sounded like they were a pair of specialized surgical shears based on my description and measurements over the phone, which I found to be quite disturbing. I remember wondering how he would even know that. I tried my best not to touch any of the surfaces, hoping that someday they might be able to lift off prints or test it for DNA. But the story seemed to bore the officer. He didn't really seem interested at all. His attitude insinuated that there was no longer an emergency, and this phone call was no longer important. At the very end of the call, as if to spice things up a bit, he did suggest that it sounded as if I was very lucky, and that I might want to hold on to the shears for a couple of days, just in case someone from his office got back to me later. I wrapped it carefully in newspaper and placed it in a brick storage unit behind our house. There they remained for several years, untouched, until we finally moved out. Not wanting to bring them across several states, I reluctantly threw them in the garbage. If you look through the old news reports, several women had gone missing all over the state of Georgia. Some bodies were eventually found, but others remain missing to this very day. I have often wondered what would have happened if that service attendant hadn't arrived when he did. If my children would still have a mother, if I would still have my son and daughter, if I would have missed all these years with them. I guess I'll never know. But I learned something very important about myself that day. I had always felt that I was pretty aware of my surroundings, pretty good at reading people, and staying safe. But because I was so exhausted and tired and hot and stranded in a different city, my common sense and intelligence simply left me for a while and wasn't working at that time. Many of my friends and family believe that our car trouble and my lack of awareness that day could have easily cost us our lives. In the summer of 2006, two groups of tourists took the now closed hiking trail at Mount Robson in British Columbia. What resulted was one of the strangest cases of missing persons in the province's history. As the son of one of the hikers who went up that day, I've naturally wanted to find out exactly what happened. Long after the investigation closed, I continued to search for answers. This is what I discovered, based on eyewitness testimony, police records, and meteorological data. The day started off a little chilly for that time of year, but not cold enough to be considered dangerous. The tour guide separated the hikers into two groups, Group A, the fast group, and Group B, the leisurely group, which was a diplomatic way of saying that they were slow. My mother, an avid hiker, was put into Group A. There was supposedly a running gag between the guides that whoever reached the summit last had to wear these embarrassing neon green socks on their next excursion. But to make things fair, would also get to lead the faster group next time. At least that's how they explained the very unfashionable socks worn by the leader of Group A that day. Both groups were estimated to reach the summit by noon, with Group A scheduled to arrive about an hour ahead of Group B. Each group had a pair of walkie-talkies for safety reasons. The hike itself was supposed to be fairly safe, taking the scenic route on multiple occasions to avoid potential danger spots. There was only one way up, and only one way down. Group A quickly took to the trail, while Group B lagged behind. They made it about 2/3 of the way up, when my mother slipped on a mossy rock and sprained her ankle. One of the guides got on the walkie-talkie and contacted Group B, who was carrying the first aid kit. At that point, Group B was a little under half an hour behind. Not wanting to ruin their reputation of being the fastest, Group A insisted on going ahead without my mom. They left her by the trail with one of the guides and a spare walkie-talkie, then resumed their hike. The temperature was getting much more comfortable by that point, so the guide and my mom didn't have to take any special measures to stay warm while they waited for Group B to catch up. For the next half hour, everyone stayed in contact using their walkie-talkies, and everything seemed fine. Group B eventually caught up to my mom. As they were tending to her ankle, they called ahead to Group A to check their progress. At that point in time, they had almost reached the summit. Once she was all patched up, my mom could have chosen to turn around and go back down the mountain with her guide. However, she chose to keep going with the slower group. I guess she really wanted to see the summit. This is where things get weird. At approximately 10:55 a.m., a sudden increase in temperature and atmospheric pressure was reported. Based on the meteorological data, there was a spike of approximately 15 degrees Celsius that dissipated by the time the devices conducted their next check. This is just an educated guess, but that means it lasted somewhere between 3 to 5 minutes. Now, to be fair, Environment Canada's meteorological services deem this spike to be a glitch, but many people in the surrounding area did in fact report feeling a sudden, but temporary, wave of heat around the same time. What followed was a low atmospheric rumble that sounded similar to thunder, and that it seemed to vibrate through the sky, but with a softer, less fluctuating tone. There were no storm clouds at the time, and no planes were reported in the area. Despite this, Group B continued up the mountain, with my mom in tow. When they reached the summit, they found themselves alone. They could see Group A's tracks all the way up to the summit, but they ended there. There were no tracks going down, and no signs of anyone going over the edge. There were no signs of them anywhere. It was assumed that their walkie-talkie had run out of battery, and since my mother and the guide had been left with their only spare, they were unable to reply. Investigators assumed that they had gotten lost in the woods and never made it to the summit at all, and that all the tracks that were found were from Group B. Whatever the case, 15 hikers went missing that day and were never found. I often ask my mom to tell me her side of the story, to clue me in on any details I may have missed, or things that hadn't been reported, but she refuses to talk about it. She'll either change the subject or stare off blankly into space until I shut up, which is very abnormal for my mom. There's only been one other thing that's ever solicited that kind of response out of her: the feet. In 2007, human feet, mostly left feet, started washing up on the shores of British Columbia. Nobody knows where they're from or who they belong to. Go ahead and look into it if you want to. It's one of those really bizarre unsolved mysteries you rarely hear about. When my mom heard about them, she became as silent as a grave. You wouldn't think these feet would be related to this story in any way. Mount Robson is on the east side of British Columbia, far inland, bordering Alberta. You wouldn't think there would be any kind of connection. But you also wouldn't think that many people wear high-end hiking boots with bright neon green socks.
When my boyfriend and I were both still in college, we rented out an Airbnb in Las Vegas during the summer. It was a modest 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom house right by the Vegas Strip, making everything in walking distance. This one summer, just wanting to get away from life and away from it all, we booked the Airbnb wanting to have a nice time. The owner was nice, but was very strict on having people over. We assured him we didn't know anyone in Vegas and would honor his wishes. Our third night there, we had just gotten back from the casino after gambling some of our spending money. We've never been to Vegas, so it was okay to gamble at least once. A few hours after we got back to the Airbnb, I was feeling a little ill, so we decided to sleep in separate bedrooms to avoid the spread. However, the bed frame in the other bedroom was broken, so we agreed that I would sleep on the bed while my boyfriend slept on the floor with a simple blanket. I felt bad in the moment, but he didn't mind it though, and we fell asleep shortly after. A few hours go by when I was suddenly awoke to my boyfriend nudging me. He was standing over the bed, trying to wake me up. I take a look at my phone and ask him in an annoyed tone what was so important at 4 a.m. There was a short pause before he said he was hungry and that we should go down to the gas station for a snack. I told him that if he was hungry that he could go himself and to let me sleep. This doesn't satisfy him though. He didn't want to go alone and insisted I go with him. This was weird as I had never seen him act like this before. There was something about his tone that was just off-putting. At least that was my logic. After several attempts of getting me to come with him, I finally obliged and put on my sandals. We walk outside of the house and start heading towards the street when my boyfriend says, "Babe, I'm not actually hungry. I woke up in the middle of the night and looked under your bed. There's someone sleeping there." My heart sank as he said this, and I repeatedly asked him questions to make sure he wasn't playing some sick joke. By some stupid luck, the person didn't see my boyfriend as they were facing the other way. We called the police, and lo and behold, they came out of the Airbnb with a homeless-looking man in handcuffs. However, he didn't try to get away and sort of just let the police arrest him. Looking back, it seemed as if he were wasted or on drugs. We still aren't sure how the man managed to sneak in the house, as the owner claims he had security cameras and would have definitely seen him. This makes us believe that this man had been inside the house for quite some time, even before us. And that's a very scary thing to think. It was the summer of 2016, and my friends and I were taking a road trip down to Miami for Ultra. Ultra is a widely popular music festival around the world that was hosted once a year with many popular celebrities. If you're a big music fan, you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, my friends that I had gone with decided to get an Airbnb to stay in, as that would be the cheaper option than a hotel, and was well within our budget. I've heard a lot of bizarre and creepy experiences when renting Airbnbs, but at the time we really didn't think much of it. We'd be at the event for the weekend, which meant that we'd also be renting the Airbnb for the whole time. It wasn't a huge house or anything, just the appropriate size for a group of friends. This had been a weekend we've all been looking forward to for about a year now, so we made the most of it. Fast forward to the day of the festival. We're all partying, having a good time, when I take notice of a man staring intently at my friend. This was common, as it's a large event with many people, so it was no surprise there were creeps. However, my friend didn't feel threatened or uncomfortable. She's had several encounters of people looking at her like this, and she sort of just let it go, as it was normal to her. We all sort of dismiss it as some harmless druggie and continue on with our night. The venue was huge with a lot of people, I'd say about 5,000, and after a night of drinking and dancing, we all had went home. It's around 1 a.m. and we're all starting to go to bed so we could get up early the next day. However, I have always had trouble sleeping throughout my life. I've always had an innate fear of the night, ever since I was a child, and for whatever reason, I guess it stuck with me through adulthood. I wasn't so much afraid of what lied in the dark, but rather the dark itself. I always saw it as some silly fear, but this night definitely confirmed my fears. At this point, it's about 2 a.m. and everyone was asleep but me. After constantly rolling around in bed, I finally got some shut-eye, when I awoke to my friend shaking me. In my groggy state, I ask her what she wanted when she says,
"Do you not hear that? Someone's walking around outside."
Now, my bed is right beside the back door, and after rubbing my eyes, I finally heard it. Someone was definitely out there, and it sure as hell wasn't any of us. At first, I would have assumed it was the owner of the home just checking on things. However, why would he be doing that in the middle of the night without us knowing? I get up from my bed and peek outside the window only to see no one there. I knew my mind definitely wasn't playing tricks on me, as I know what I heard. As I get out of bed to go see who it was, I then hear the scream of one of my other friends from another room. Upon rushing into her room, I opened the door and was greeted to a man who I could only recognize as the same man from the concert. The minute he saw me, he basically jumped outside the already open window and ran off into the night. Our two male friends had gone after him, but had given up after they couldn't find him. Police were involved, but there was nothing much they could do other than conducting a police report. We had contacted the actual owner of the house, who was thankfully very understanding and refunded our stay. Since we don't live in Miami, we had to end our trip short and head back home, which was an 8-hour drive. This was many years ago, and my friend has since gotten therapy because of this. She's obviously moved on from it now, but she still talks about it with people till this day. I still mourn over the fact that my friend could have been killed that night if she hadn't woken up. I still have no idea as to how that man from the show managed to find us. My only guess was that he simply followed us, but kept his distance while doing so. I've always wondered about what he might have done had I not gone into the room in time. We've never been back to Miami since, and we also don't rent Airbnbs anymore. This world is full of dangerous and evil people who actually want to cause harm to others. If you ever plan on renting Airbnbs, please do so carefully. Make sure all of the doors and windows are locked at night. You never know who might be lurking.
My brothers, my partner, my best friend and I all recently took a trip to Kansas City to go to the Orville Peck concert. We waited until a sort of last minute to reserve an Airbnb because we weren't all 100% sure who was all going. Nonetheless, we found one just outside of Kansas City, in a suburb called Grandview, at a pretty reasonable rate. The host's overall rating was good, and we didn't see anything out of the ordinary when reading the first few reviews, so we thought we had gotten a fairly good deal. We arrived in Grandview a little after 3 p.m., and our Airbnb was the bottom floor of the owner's home. As we pulled up to the house, we noticed quite a bit of religious signs and statues on the lawn. Now don't get me wrong, I don't have an issue with people believing in whatever they believe in, so long as it doesn't infringe upon other people's rights. But here we are, a group of very visibly queer folks about to attend a gay country concert, blindly walking into someone's home that we'd be staying in for the next 2 nights. We decided there was nothing to be worried about. And after all, we technically were in the Bible Belt, so we shouldn't be surprised that we're staying in the home of someone who is religious. My brother and partner called the host and met her at the door of our guest suite. She showed them around while the rest of us got our suitcases unloaded. When they came back to meet us, they said that she was super nice. And again, our minds were eased. We decided to hang out, order food, and rest a little before we headed off for the concert that night. Our comfort did not last long though. While we were getting our suitcases unpacked, laying around in one of the bedrooms of our guest suite, my youngest brother was casually looking through the drawers of the dressers and side tables, as anyone would do. Most of what he found was normal. Extra bed sheets, pens, paper tablets, nothing really out of the ordinary. That is, until he came across something that would completely change our outlook on the trip itself. Inside the drawer was a Bible, not super weird considering where we were staying, but he was flipping through the pages of it. A small tinfoil packet fell out. Now, for those of you who don't know anything about drugs or what they look like, what fell out of that Bible rhymes with smack star Sarowin. That's right, not even 30 minutes into our stay, my youngest brother found hard drugs in the folds of a Bible. At this point, we weren't really sure what to do. We did not want to tell the host, and we most certainly did not want to call the cops. We contemplated about taking the packet and throwing it away at some random gas station. But ultimately, we decided to put it back where we found it and act like none of us had seen it. We got our food and started to get ready for the concert. While the rest of us got ready, my partner, who was not going to the concert, started reading through the household handbook. Everything seemed pretty standard except a few lines that read something like, "We will respect your privacy so long as you respect ours. We can be available as you need us to be. And if you're interested in speaking about the ministries of God, feel free to reach out." Again, I have nothing against people following the religions that they do, but that seemed like an awfully out of place thing to put in your house rules handbook for your guest suite. There were a few more books lying around that stuck out a little off base with titles like Teaching Men to Comprehend How Women Think and How Women Should Think. We ignored these things for the most part, aside from my partner who is now freaked out about being left alone at the suite while the rest of us went off to the concert. I told him it was just some Bible thumping and that he really didn't have anything to worry about. He's a worrywart though. So as soon as we left, he locked himself in the bedroom and started looking a little more into the books that we had found. He came to the realization that the books were associated with the group called International House of Prayer, a prominent religious cult founded in Kansas City, a majority of whose members live in the Grandview suburb, where we were staying. I could write a whole separate post about the beliefs of those members, but essentially, they are an evangelical Christian group that has a functioning 24/7 prayer room that has been going non-stop since 1999. It's all too much to go over here. We got back from the concert really late, and not to mention a couple of us were still heavily intoxicated from drinking. So he didn't mention much about it that night, but he was very quick to tell us about it the next morning. At this point, we thought, okay, these people are part of some weird church, whatever, it's fine. That explains some of the weird rules and books we had found. We left for the day to go hang out around the city. And when we got back to rest, my friend and partner started doing some more reading on the group. That is when they found out that we were actually staying in one of the prominent leaders' houses. We figured this out by cross-referencing the names of our hosts with the names of important members on the International House of Prayer University website. After this, we started to snoop a little more in our suite. We found large barrels of dried food, a jug of some liquid that we later found out is what they drink while they fast, and lots more teaching materials. Basically, it seemed like they were completely prepared for some sort of end times rapture. Eventually, we did go back and read more thoroughly through some of the reviews, and found a few that would have set off some red flags. For example, one of the reviews stated how the male owner brought out a gun in front of the people who were staying there. Yikes. Not to mention, if there was even a hint of a negative review left, the host would leave a snarky reply. Needless to say, we spent as much of our time as possible away from that Airbnb as we could for the remainder of our trip. And although we were never in any direct danger, we did feel very uncomfortable throughout the entire thing. I've gotten a lot of questions about the heroin. First off, I know that it doesn't come back up in our story, but ultimately, it was the catalyst to all the other weird stuff that we slowly uncovered. And I knew it was heroin because I've seen it before. I have family and friends that have used it, and it is also one of the first things to come up if you Google drugs in foil packet. I do not know if it was left there by a previous guest or if it was the owners. Either way, finding it in a Bible within our first hour of being there was off-putting to say the very least. After reading a few posts on here, I've decided to add one of the creepier, still unexplained events that happened to me and a group of friends within the past 5 years. Thinking back on it, I still get this unnerved bad feeling that sort of lingers. Anyway, here goes. A group of friends and myself rented out a place on the week just for a fun-filled, drunken weekend. We were all in our young to mid-20s, and it was supposed to be just for a big party. For the most part, that's exactly what it was. The Friday night and Saturday morning, we pretty much went all out, having a blast on the water, just doing fun, stupid stuff. Well, naturally, when Saturday afternoon rolled around, we were all so dead from going all out, we decided it would just be a night of no drinking, maybe a little weed smoking, and just have a chill evening and night. And that's exactly what it was, very relaxed. So 9 p.m. rolls around, and about 8 of us were inside the house and 5 outside the house. It was a 2-story house with a 2nd-story deck / back porch, and it was surrounded by the woods, and then down through the woods, you would hit the lake. I'll mention that we had already experienced some weird vibes from the locals when we first arrived, mostly just backcountry old-timers that I assumed were leering and irritated because we were a bunch of college-age kids looking to have a good time. But the town and the lake were so large, it's not like anyone knew where we were staying. Anyways, 3 of my friends were upstairs on the back porch, and my other friend and I were downstairs outside, just talking a little on this old table near the woods. I mean, it was otherwise just a really nice night. My friend and I were just getting lost in conversation, and all of a sudden, there was this weird feeling that encompassed us. Like an unnerving physical experience that came from the woods down behind us. It was so strong we both kind of just quieted down, and then out of nowhere, this loud chanting abruptly came from the woods. I have no idea how far away it was because of the way the lake is set up. I'm pretty sure the voices carried up through the forest though. It sounded like a cult chanting away, and all the voices were male. I mean, they were loud and perfectly in sync. I think we were frozen for all about 20 seconds before I couldn't contain myself anymore and darted towards the house with her following behind. It's hard to describe, and I don't know how to explain the feeling that came with that chanting, but it was definitely evil. Like something just so powerfully uninviting. I was shaking by the time we got up to the second story and ran out onto the balcony with our other 3 friends, one of them being my brother. By the time we got up there, the chanting was gone, and I naturally asked, "Did you guys hear that?" in the most shaky, freaked out voice. They all had heard it too, and not just seconds later, the chanting began again. So the 5 of us are out there peering into the forest, listening to the chanting that would sometimes sound far away and then sound relatively close. All male voices in the weirdest language, or I don't even know what it was. Sounded like some strange extreme church. Then following the chanting, a loud bang, like someone hit a huge metal object sounded. And then, the worst part came. A man wailing, like in extreme pain wailing. All of my hair was up. It was the freakiest experience ever. My brother and I were staring at one another in a mixture of scared, excitement, and horror. The wailing stopped, and then it was back to the chanting, which eventually died out. I was so freaked out by it that I wanted to call the cops, because whoever was screaming had definitely been in a lot of pain. And that mixed with the weird chanting just made me immediately think of some terrible sacrifice going on. One friend tried to say it had to be some drunk guys just messing around, singing, and being weird. But no way was that coming from some drunk guys. They were perfectly in sync. Then the bang, then the wail of pain. And then, all that weird tension and energy was just gone. Nope. I didn't call the cops, and I wish I would have. But honestly, the forest was so large, and since the lake house was up looking down at the woods in the lake, it could have been anywhere. It definitely wasn't in our close proximity, but close enough to hear all of it that perfectly. We all went inside and got some of the others, but by the time they came out, the chanting had stopped. Someone wanted to go out and explore and find where the sound had been coming from, but obviously that was a stupid idea. After that, I was so ready to go home. I can't explain the relief of driving away from there the next morning. Even now, it gives me the worst feeling ever. Whatever that was, it felt so wrong and so evil. I will never forget it. I can only imagine that it was some kind of weird cult stuff. A story on here reminded me of the time some friends and I had stayed in what turned out to be the 3rd most shadiest hotel in Las Vegas, which for Las Vegas is definitely saying something. I also managed to inadvertently traumatize the entirety of my company, as I recounted what I considered to be just an amusing childhood story. The hotel itself was a bit of a nightmare, as everything was bolted down and none of the doors locked. But I digress. The story itself is about my family's run-in with Satanists on a trip to upstate New York. Though, the growing expressions of disbelief and horror on my companions' faces assured me that the story was not, as I had previously considered, funny per se. In any case, what follows is completely true, and everyone present swears by this narrative. When I was 5 years of age, we took a road trip to upstate New York to see my grandmother on my father's side, as well as to tour around the countryside a little bit. There we were, in rural upstate, away from the region in which my grandmother actually lives, and we were planning on staying in a bed and breakfast my father had booked ahead of time. It had been an unexpectedly long drive due to weather complications, and when we found the B&B in question, we were all quite tired. We went up to the door to check in, and a woman missing her 2 front teeth on both jaws answered. She invited us in, but warned us that they didn't have a room for the night. They were booked solid. My father protested that he had made arrangements in advance, but she said she knew another hotel that had vacancy just up the way, and she would give them a call, and she assured him that they would offer the same rates. But first, she insisted on showing my parents around, as her husband was an artist and she wanted to show them his studio and his quote-unquote famous artwork. We were all invited in, but after seeing the first few pieces of naked women missing their front teeth, bound, or being tortured in various ways, my parents opted to leave the kids outside with Grandma. Apparently most of the rooms were full to the ceiling with similarly foreboding images of dead or dying people, with the occasional sculpture of menacing animals. My parents were a bit creeped out, but just figured these people were a little eccentric, and they had dodged a bullet by ending up somewhere else. We all waited out back while the woman called her friend, beside a pit containing what could have been nothing other than an altar covered with pentagrams. My mother mentioned that it seemed strange that not only had they not met the husband, who was supposedly there somewhere, having toured the entire house, but there hadn't been a single sign of life or piece of luggage suggesting that anyone else was actually staying in any of these guest rooms in this supposedly fully booked B&B. A side note that's probably not worth mentioning, but I've found strange when my mother brought it up while telling me the story later, was that we stopped by a park to stretch our legs at some point before proceeding to the next place. The storm was closing in on us, and my parents wanted to be sure we had zero energy upon arrival. While in this park, my mother claimed that one of us found and brought to her a small necklace with a pendant on it. The pendant itself was a pentagram on one side with a Third Reich symbol on the other. My mother took it away and put it inside her purse. We arrived at the next bed and breakfast to be greeted by a different woman, also suspiciously missing her 2 front teeth, upper and lower. It was about this time that my grandmother mentioned that she had read a lot of articles recently about tourists being killed by some cult of Satanists or some such in this area. Great. She tended to tell a lot of tall tales, so I think my parents kind of rolled their eyes and dismissed it. But they made a point to mention it later. The storm was now upon us, and we were all exhausted. And there was nowhere else to stay that we could find anywhere near there. My dad decided we would make do with whatever they had to offer. What they had to offer was a slightly renovated barn. During the bustle of moving our luggage in, the woman kept inviting my brother and I into the house, saying she had some sweets, and wouldn't we like to meet her kitties? She made it clear, however, that my parents were not welcome into the house because it was too messy, and she would be embarrassed. We were then herded away into the barn and told not to talk to the lady. Once inside, my father, who was by this time a bit creeped out, went about checking the beds and securing the one-room barn unit. The windows had no coverings whatsoever, and the doors had no locks. We placed pillows from the couches in the window frames, and my dad grabbed a dresser against one wall to block the door. When he went to move the dresser, he discovered it was on wheels, which were completely silent. He also noticed that the wall behind it moved a little when he shifted the dresser. When he scrutinized the wall, he found a seam. He pushed on the wall and it gave way, 2 invisible doors opening outwards into the night. And just outside was a dark-colored van which had been backed up to the opening. Livid, my dad went about rearranging all the furniture in the room, stacking the heaviest against the outward swinging doors, and moving the mobile dresser with various loud objects behind it against the main door. When he had completed this, we all started to settle down. This was around 11 p.m. The woman brought us freshly baked blueberry muffins. Now, as I mentioned before, I don't remember much of this trip, but this is one element I have a vivid recollection of. With the inclement weather and the rush to find a place to stay, complemented by the lack of restaurants in the area, we hadn't had what one might consider a proper meal. When you're 5, dinner is very important. The muffins were fresh baked and smelled heavenly, and I wanted one more than anything else in the world. However, presuming, and probably correctly, that they were poisoned or something was seriously wrong about them, since this entire thing was beginning to feel like a horror movie. My mother absolutely forbid us from even going near them. She put them on a high shelf and sent us to bed. I was so angry. I went to bed hungry and irritable. Only 2 things happened that night that I can recall. My parents slept very lightly, when at all, as you can imagine. They claimed they kept hearing talking outside. My sister woke all of us up with a blood-curdling scream around 1 a.m. for reasons unknown. She was usually a very quiet baby. When my parents got up and milled about for an hour trying to get her back to bed, my mom noticed something on the wall as she was walking her around and called my father over. What I would later learn was the picture hanging to one side of that door that during the daylight seemed to be logs in a recently extinguished fire pit in a tranquil forest scene, but by night was unmistakably burning corpses with a hooded, smoky figure looming over them. We got up the next morning, packed up early, and waited for the lady to get up so we could pay and leave. While my parents were packing the bags, the woman came around back and gave my brother and I small wooden cats carved into the form of napkin holders, each a different color, and she had written little notes on. As my father was paying after loading us into the car, my mom began kicking gravel around the dirt absentmindedly. The woman came over to say goodbye and waved to us with her gapped grin, and my mother noticed that she was trying to discreetly recover the tiles that she was uncovered under the gravel. Before driving off, my mother got back out of the car and uncovered one of the tiles, and she claimed it was the same pentagram with the Third Reich symbol within it that she had seen a similar version of in that park, prompting her to notice, as we drove away, that the necklace was no longer in her purse. The likelihood of it simply falling out of the purse pocket she had placed it in was, as she put it, quite unlikely. People listening to this story seemed appalled at the fact that I still have that little wooden cat that the nice lady had given me, sitting in my bedroom. I know this all sounds very strange, but I can only assure you that it matches well with my memory of the events. And all the adults who were there tell the same story. Personally, I'm glad it's just a weird story we look back on with confusion, and that nothing stranger actually happened that night. Update. According to my mom, whom I spoke with today, it was near Millbrook, and one was a farm and the other was an old mill. I actually found the website for the B&B. It's still running, but with different owners. I don't know that I should post a link, however. They seemed like nice people who have improved it quite a lot.